Tonight, we are uncovering the complete history of the Order of the Phoenix, every secret it kept, and every sacrifice its members made. This is a story of quiet courage, but I will keep my narration calm and steady, so you can drift off to sleep whenever you are ready. Thank you to everyone who has been joining us night after night. If you are falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you have been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. If these stories help you rest, subscribing means we can keep making them for you. Now, settle in, and we will begin. Somewhere in Britain, in the darkest years of the First Wizarding War, a photograph was taken. It shows a group of witches and wizards crowded together, some waving, some laughing, some barely fitting into the frame. Alastor Moody kept a copy of it. Years later, he would show it to a boy named Harry Potter and point out the faces one by one. That one gave Voldemort a real fight before they got him. That one died 2 weeks after this was taken. Those two needed 5 Death Eaters to bring them down. It is a casual, devastating inventory, delivered in the flat voice of a man who had attended too many funerals to soften the details anymore. That photograph is the closest thing we have to a portrait of the original Order of the Phoenix. And the story behind it, the story of who those people were, why they gathered, what they knew that no one else knew, and what it cost them, is one of the saddest and most quietly heroic stories in the entire history of the wizarding world. Because the Order was never an army. It was never large, never well-funded, never officially recognized. At its height in the First War, it may have counted only a few dozen active members against an enemy whose followers, creatures, and coerced allies outnumbered them by something close to 20 to 1. They were schoolteachers and barmen, junior ministry clerks and fresh graduates barely out of Hogwarts. They met in borrowed rooms and hidden houses. Most of the wizarding public never knew they existed. Many of them died without the public ever learning their names. To understand why such an organization had to exist at all, we have to go back to the years before it was founded, to the slow, creeping decade when a wizard, who had once been a charming schoolboy named Tom Riddle, began to gather followers under a new name. The rise of Lord Voldemort in the 1960s and 70s did not look, at first, like a war. It looked like a series of unrelated tragedies. A family found dead in their home, with no marks on their bodies. A Muggle village struck by a gas leak that no engineer could explain. Then a ministry employee who changed his testimony overnight and could not say why. Disappearances that the Daily Prophet reported on page 4, then page 7, then not at all. The Ministry of Magic was slow to understand what it was facing, and more still to admit it. There were procedures for dark wizards. There were auras, trials, cells in Azkaban. What there were no procedures for was an enemy who did not want to be caught committing crimes, who worked through fear, blackmail, and the imperious curse, and whose followers stood in the very hallways of the ministry itself, wearing respectable faces. By the time open attacks began, the infection was already deep. Nobody knew who to trust. That phrase appears again and again in the memories of those who lived through it. You did not know if the person selling you potion ingredients was reporting your purchases. Your colleague might have a dark mark under his sleeve. And when a friend acted strangely, there was no telling whether they were frightened, cursed, or complicit. Albus Dumbledore watched all of this from Hogwarts, and he understood something the Ministry refused to grasp for years. Voldemort could not be fought by an institution, because institutions were exactly what he knew how to corrupt. A government has doors, and doors can be opened with gold or fear. What was needed was something smaller and stranger. A group bound by personal trust rather than official oath. A group with no building to attack, no payroll to trace, no minister to intimidate. One that existed, in a sense, only as a promise between people who believed in one another. So, at some point around the year 1970, as the violence sharpened into open war, Dumbledore founded the Order of the Phoenix. He named it, characteristically, after his own companion. Fawkes the Phoenix had been at Dumbledore's side for longer than anyone could remember, and the choice of name was more than sentiment. A phoenix cannot truly be killed. Strike it down at the height of its power, and it bursts into flame, and from the ashes something small and grey and half-blind crawls out and begins again. Dumbledore was telling his recruits, in a single word, what he expected of them. They would burn. Some of them would burn completely, and the work would continue anyway, carried by whoever crawled out of the ashes. The secrets began at the very beginning, because secrecy was the Order's only real armor. There was no membership list kept anywhere that could be stolen. Members were recruited one at a time, in person, usually by Dumbledore himself, or by someone he trusted absolutely, and each recruitment was a terrible gamble. To invite someone into the Order was to hand them the power to destroy it. Moody, who trusted almost no one, is said to have argued against several recruitments and been overruled. He was, as the years would prove, right to worry, though wrong about which face the betrayal would wear. Communication was its own secret art. The Order could not use owls for anything sensitive. Owls could be intercepted, followed, or simply watched, and a pattern of birds arriving at a particular house was as good as a signed confession. The Flu network ran through the Ministry, and the Ministry leaked. So Dumbledore invented something new. He found a way to use the Patronus charm, that silvery guardian conjured against Dementors, as a messenger. A Patronus could speak with its caster's voice, travel at tremendous speed, pass through any barrier, and could not be faked, because a Patronus is shaped by the soul of the one who casts it. No Death Eater could counterfeit another wizard's Patronus. Most Death Eaters, creatures of fear rather than joy, could not produce one at all. It was an elegant, quiet advantage, and the Order guarded the technique jealously. For years, a silver animal streaking across the sky at night was the only visible trace of the organization's existence, and almost no one who saw one understood what they were looking at. Meetings moved constantly. A back room, a cellar, a cottage under enchantments, and later, famously, the Hogshead Inn in Hogsmeade, that grimy, goat-smelling establishment, whose barman poured drinks slowly and asked no questions. The barman was the deepest secret of all, though we will come to him properly later. His name was Aberforth Dumbledore, and he was the founder's estranged brother, a man who thought Albus's grand plans had already cost their family everything, and who watched the Order's comings and goings with a bitterness he never fully explained to any of them. Who were they, these first members? The photograph gives us names, and behind each name there is a life that the war would bend or break. There was Alastor Moody himself, already the most famous aura of his generation, a man whose body was a map of the war, before the war even had a name. He would eventually lose an eye, a leg, and a piece of his nose to it, and gain the magical replacement eye that gave him his nickname, Mad Eye, an electric blue thing that spun in its socket and saw through wood, cloaks, and lies. Moody filled half the cells in Azkaban personally, and unlike many auras of the era, he brought his prisoners in alive when he could. He killed only when there was no other way. In a war that coarsened almost everyone, that restraint was its own kind of defiance. There was Elphias Doge, Dumbledore's oldest friend, a wheezy-voiced wizard who had known Albus since their first day at Hogwarts, when Doge was recovering from dragonpox, and no one else would go near him. There was Daedalus Diggle, an excitable little man in a violet top hat, so bad at containing his joy that he once caused shooting stars over Kent and made the Muggle news. There was Emmeline Vance, stately and composed, and Sturgis Podmore, square-jawed with a thatch of straw-coloured hair, and Hestia Jones would come later, but the first war roster ran deeper and darker than the survivors' names suggest. There were the Pruitt brothers, Gideon and Fabian, two of the most gifted fighters the Order ever had. Their sister Molly had married a quiet, kindly ministry man named Arthur Weasley, and while Molly raised her growing family, her brothers went to war. Moody's verdict on them was simple. It took 5 Death Eaters to kill them, and they died like heroes. 5 against 2, and the 2 made the 5 earn every second of it. Molly would keep a watch that had belonged to Fabian, and decades later, she would give it to a boy named Harry on his 17th birthday, dented and old, because in her family, the most precious things were the ones that had survived. There was Benji Fenwick. History records almost nothing about him except the manner of his death, which was so brutal that Moody could only say they found bits of him, one phrase, and an entire human life behind it. There was Caradoc Dearborn, who simply vanished. No body was ever found, no grave was ever dug, and for the rest of their lives the survivors could not properly mourn him, because some small, cruel part of hope never closed. There was Dorcas Meadows, and her death carried a distinction so terrible, it was almost an honor. Voldemort did not send followers to deal with her, he came himself. Whatever Dorcas Meadows knew, or did, or threatened. It was enough to draw the Dark Lord out personally, and she died by his own wand. The Order never spoke publicly about why. It is one of the secrets that went into the ground with her. There was Edgar Bones, of the old and respected Bones family, described by Moody as a great wizard, killed along with his wife and children. Not just the fighter, the family. That was the message Voldemort sent when he struck at the Order. Joining did not put a target on your back, it put a target on your house. Marlene McKinnon learned the same lesson. She was in the photograph too, smiling, and 2 weeks after it was taken, the McKinnons were attacked, and Marlene died with her whole family around her. When the news came, a young Order member named Lily Potter sat down and wrote to a friend that she had cried all evening. And then there were the young ones. In the late 1970s, a group of friends walked out of Hogwarts and almost directly into the Order's ranks. James Potter, wealthy, talented, and reckless in the way only the truly loved can be reckless. Lily Evans, soon to be Lily Potter, one of the most gifted witches of her year, Muggle-born in an era when being Muggle-born was becoming a death sentence. Sirius Black, heir to the most fanatically pure-blooded family in Britain, who had run away from home at 16 and joined the war largely to spite everything his family stood for, though it grew into something far deeper. Remus Lupin, quiet, threadbare, and carrying a secret that predated the war entirely. He was a werewolf, bitten as a small child, and the Order was one of the only places in wizarding society that would have him. And Peter Pettigrew, smaller, slower, always half a step behind his brilliant friends, who joined because they joined, and who nobody, at the beginning, thought about very much at all. Hold on to Peter Pettigrew. The entire tragedy turns on him. Hagrid was there too, half-giant gamekeeper of Hogwarts, whose loyalty to Dumbledore was so total it functioned almost as a force of nature. And in time the Order gained a member whose recruitment remains one of the strangest and most closely guarded stories of the whole war. A former Death Eater named Severus Snape. But his road into the Order was carved by a prophecy, and the prophecy deserves to be told in its proper place, because everything, all of it, converges there. First, though, understand what the work actually was, because the Order's daily reality was less like an adventure and more like a long, grinding shift that never ended. Members kept their ordinary jobs, since a salary was cover and a workplace was a listening post. Arthur Weasley and others inside the ministry watched for the drift of policy, for officials who changed their positions too smoothly, for the fingerprints of the imperious curse in a colleague's suddenly vacant eyes. Others tracked Death Eater movements, trying to map a network that hid behind masks, precisely so that no captured member could betray more than a few names. Some guarded families that Voldemort had marked. Some tried, mostly in vain, to reach the communities the ministry had spent centuries alienating, because Voldemort was recruiting there too. The giants, hunted nearly to extinction by wizard kind, listened to his envoys. The Dementors of Azkaban, creatures that fed on despair, understood that a Voldemort victory meant an endless feast, and the ministry's own prison guards began slipping toward the enemy. Werewolves, denied jobs and dignity by wizarding law, heard a recruiter named Fenrir Greyback promise them prey and revenge. Remus Lupin was sent to live among them, underground, for months at a time, arguing for a side that had never once argued for him. It was lonely, dangerous, mostly thankless work, and it aged him. The Order was losing. It is important to say that plainly, because later generations sometimes imagine a noble struggle trending toward victory. The people inside it had no such comfort. They were outnumbered, outfunded, and out-terrorized. For every Death Eater the Aurors caught, the imperious curse turned 2 more decent people into puppets. Attendance at Order meetings shrank. The photographs' smiling faces went into the ground one by one, and the survivors kept a private arithmetic they never said aloud, counting who was left, and wondering in the small hours which of them was next. And into that fear crept something worse than fear. Somewhere near the end of the 1970s, the Order realized it had a leak. Operations went wrong in ways that only insider knowledge could explain. Safe houses were not safe. Ambushes were anticipated. Dumbledore knew, and the members knew, that one of the faces at the table belonged to a traitor, and the poison of that knowledge did almost as much damage as the traitor's actual reports. Old friends began keeping things from each other. Sirius Black, proud and pure-blooded by birth, began to suspect Remus Lupin, because a werewolf had every reason to resent the wizarding world, and Voldemort was known to be recruiting his kind. Remus, in turn, was given reasons to wonder about Sirius, whose entire family tree was stitched into the enemy's cause. Each of them was wrong. The traitor was the friend neither of them had ever thought to doubt, because doubting him would have felt like kicking a stray dog. Peter Pettigrew had been passing information to Lord Voldemort for a full year before the end. He was not turned by ideology. He was turned by terror, and by a lifetime of standing in taller shadows. And when he finally chose, he chose the side he believed would win. While that rot spread inside the Order, an event occurred, a short walk from its most frequent meeting place, that would decide the fate of everyone in the photograph. On a cold evening, in a room above the bar of the Hog's Head Inn, Albus Dumbledore interviewed a woman named Sybil Trelawney for the post of divination teacher at Hogwarts. He had gone reluctantly. He considered the subject dubious and had half a mind to abolish it. Trelawney, the great-great-granddaughter of a genuinely celebrated seer, gave an unimpressive interview, and Dumbledore had risen to leave when her voice changed. It went harsh and hollow, her eyes rolled, and something spoke through her that was not entirely her. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, it said. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Trelawney remembered none of it. She got the job, in part because Dumbledore realized she now needed protecting, but the prophecy had been overheard. A young Death Eater had been listening at the door, on his master's business, and he was caught partway through by the barman, Aberforth, and thrown out of the inn. Partway through, he heard the beginning. The child born as July died to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times, and he did not hear the end, the part about a power the Dark Lord knew not, the part that made the prophecy a warning as much as a promise. He carried his half of it straight to Voldemort. The eavesdropper's name was Severus Snape. Voldemort heard the words and did what tyrants always do with oracles. He chose an interpretation that flattered his fears. 2 families in the Order fit the description. The Longbottoms, Frank and Alice, both Auras, both beloved, had defied him 3 times, and were expecting a son at the end of July. The Potters, James and Lily, had defied him 3 times as well, and Lily's child was due in the same window. Neville Longbottom was born on the 30th of July. Harry Potter was born on the 31st. Voldemort weighed the 2 infants and settled on Harry, and the choice itself is one of the strangest secrets of the war, because nothing in the prophecy pointed at either boy specifically. Dumbledore would later suggest that Voldemort saw more of himself in the half-blood child of a Muggle-born mother than in the pure-blooded Longbottom heir. In choosing Harry, he marked him as his equal, and so made the prophecy true with his own hands. Prophecies, Dumbledore always insisted, only matter because people act on them. Voldemort acted. Snape learned who the target was, and something in him broke. Whatever he was, whatever he had done, Severus Snape had loved Lily Evans since they were children, in the same shabby mill town, before either of them ever saw Hogwarts. He had lost her friendship years earlier, through his own choices, through the friends he kept, and the word he called her in a moment of humiliated rage, and he had watched her marry James Potter, the boy he hated most in the world. He had joined the Death Eaters. The prophecy itself had gone to Voldemort in his own ambitious hands, and now his master intended to walk into Lily's house and murder her family. Snape begged Voldemort to spare her. Voldemort, amused, agreed carelessly, the way one agrees to leave the wrapping paper intact. Snape knew what such promises were worth, and so, at what he believed might be the cost of his life, he went to the one wizard Voldemort had ever feared. The meeting between Dumbledore and Snape took place on a windswept hilltop at night, and it is among the most closely kept secrets in the Order's entire history. Snape came armed and terrified. Dumbledore came alone, and was, by his own later account, colder in that hour than almost any other moment of his life, because before him stood the man whose eavesdropping had aimed a killing curse at a 1-year-old child. "What do you offer me in return?" Dumbledore asked, when Snape pleaded for Lily's protection. "Anything," Snape said. That word became a chain he wore for the rest of his life. From that night, Severus Snape was Dumbledore's man, a double agent inside Voldemort's inner circle, and the depth of his allegiance was a secret Dumbledore shared with no other living person, with neither Moody nor McGonagall, with no one at all. For nearly 2 decades, only 2 people on Earth knew the true shape of Severus Snape's soul, and one of them was Snape. The Order moved to protect both families. The Longbottoms and the Potters went into hiding, and for the Potters, Dumbledore proposed the strongest concealment magic known, the Fidelius Charm. It is a strange and beautiful piece of magic, a secret. In this case, the location of the Potter's house in the village of Godric's Hollow is sealed inside the living soul of a single person, the Secret Keeper. Once the charm is cast, the hidden thing cannot be found by anyone the Keeper has not personally told. Voldemort could have pressed his face against their sitting room window and seen nothing. The house did not exist for him. The entire fortress had exactly one door, and the door was a human being. Dumbledore offered to be the Secret Keeper himself. James Potter, with the confidence that had defined his whole life, declined, and chose Sirius Black instead. Sirius was his brother in everything but blood. Sirius would die before betraying them, and everyone knew it, including Voldemort, which is exactly what worried Sirius. In the last days before the charm was cast, he proposed a piece of tradecraft that he would regret for the rest of his life. He was the obvious keeper, he argued, so let him be a decoy. Let the enemy hunt him, while the real secret sat with someone no one would ever suspect. Someone small and quiet, and beneath the notice of the great players of the war. They switched, in absolute secrecy, telling no one, not even Dumbledore. The secret keeper of the Potters became Peter Pettigrew, and Peter Pettigrew had been Voldemort's informant for a year. He held out less than a week. On the evening of the 31st of October 1981, Halloween night, Voldemort walked through Godric's Hollow, past children in costumes, and came to a house he could suddenly see. James Potter was in the sitting room. He had left his wand on the sofa. His last act was to shout for Lily to take Harry and run, and to place himself, unarmed, between the Dark Lord and the stairs. It bought seconds. Upstairs, Lily barricaded the nursery door with her own body. Voldemort, keeping his careless promise to Snape in his own fashion, told her to stand aside. 3 times he said it. Stand aside, girl. She refused 3 times, begging him to take her instead, and in refusing, in dying when she had been offered the chance to live, she invoked something older than any curse he knew. He killed her, and then he turned his wand on the child, and the killing curse that had never failed him rebounded off a protection woven from a mother's freely given death. The house tore open. Voldemort's body was destroyed, his spirit ripped loose, and reduced to something less than a ghost, and it fled. In the wreckage of the nursery, under a broken ceiling, and beside his mother, a 1-year-old boy sat crying, with a fresh cut on his forehead, in the shape of lightning. The war ended in an hour. Across Britain, the dark mark faded on the arms of Death Eaters, and owls flew in daylight, and wizards in violet cloaks hugged strangers in the streets. Daedalus Diggle's shooting stars lit up Kent, and in the middle of the celebration, the Order of the Phoenix counted what victory had cost, and found that it looked almost exactly like defeat. The Potters were dead. The traitor was unmasked far too late, and the unmasking itself became one of the cruelest injustices of the era. Sirius Black cornered Peter Pettigrew in a Muggle street, and Peter, in the finest performance of his mediocre life, shouted for the whole street to hear that Sirius had betrayed Lily and James. Then he blew the street apart behind his own back, killed 12 Muggles, cut off his own finger, transformed into a rat, his secret unregistered animagus form, and vanished into the sewers. When the ministry arrived, they found devastation, a heap of blood-stained clothes, a finger, and Sirius Black standing in the middle of it, laughing. It was not the laughter of guilt, it was the laughter of a man whose mind was breaking. He was sent to Azkaban without a trial. Not a short trial, no trial at all. The Order believed him guilty. Remus Lupin, the last of the 4 friends still standing free, believed it too, and lived 12 years with the belief that one friend had murdered the other 2, and that he himself had spent the war suspected by people he loved. Every part of that sentence is a wound. The Longbottom's fate was crueler still, because it came after everyone thought the danger had passed. Voldemort's most fanatical followers refused to accept that he was gone. 4 of them, led by Bellatrix Lestrange, hunted for their vanished master, and they decided that Frank and Alice Longbottom, 2 of the Order's finest aurors, must know where he was. They did not. It made no difference. The Lestrangers and Barty Crouch Jr. took the Longbottoms and tortured them with the Cruciatus Curse for information that did not exist, and they did not stop. And the two Aurors who had defied Voldemort 3 times were driven permanently out of their own minds. They survived. That word does heavy lifting. They lived out their days in a closed ward at St. Mungo's Hospital, unable to recognize the son they had protected. Neville Longbottom, the other boy of the prophecy, was raised by his grandmother, and he visited his parents during the holidays, and his mother would sometimes shuffle to him in her hospital nightgown and press an empty sweet wrapper into his hand. He kept them, every one. It is worth pausing on that image, because when people ask what the Order of the Phoenix sacrificed, the honest answer includes a boy's pockets full of sweet wrappers. With Voldemort gone, the Order quietly dissolved. There was no ceremony. There was nothing to disband, really, since it had never officially existed. Its members scattered back into their lives and carried the decade in silence. Dumbledore returned to running his school and to a project he told almost no one about, the slow gathering of proof for a suspicion that had settled in him like winter. He did not believe Voldemort was dead. The manner of the vanishing was wrong. There had been no body, and Dumbledore, nearly alone in Wizarding Britain, had spent years assembling a theory about how a wizard might anchor himself to life through the darkest magic in existence, splitting his own soul and hiding the pieces. He placed the orphaned Harry Potter with his Muggle aunt, a decision the Order privately hated because it was the coldest and safest move on the board. Lily's sacrifice lived in her blood, and her blood lived in her sister. And while Harry could call the house of Petunia Dursley his home, the protection that had unmade Voldemort held over him like a sky. It condemned the boy to a loveless childhood in a cupboard under the stairs. Dumbledore knew and weighed it, and chose survival. He carried the guilt of that arithmetic for the rest of his life, and it was among the many things he never explained to anyone until it was nearly too late. For 13 years, the Order of the Phoenix was a memory held by a shrinking circle of the middle-aged. And then, in June of 1995, in a graveyard in Little Hangleton, a cauldron boiled over, and a voice that had not been heard in the flesh since Halloween of 1981 said, "Robe me." Voldemort returned, remade by a ritual of bone, flesh and blood, and the blood was Harry Potter's, taken by force, which the Dark Lord believed made him immune at last to the old protection. He summoned his Death Eaters within minutes of standing upright. The Order's second summons took barely an hour longer. That same night, in the Hogwarts hospital wing, over the objections of the Minister for Magic himself, Dumbledore turned to Sirius Black, who was by now a fugitive whose innocence only a handful of people knew, and gave the order that restarted the war. "Alert the old crowd," he said. "Remus Lupin, Arabella Figg, Mundungus Fletcher," the names of 1979, spoken again in 1995, and a fire that had gutted for 13 years came back alight. The Ministry's reaction to Voldemort's return is a story of its own, and it shaped everything the reborn Order was forced to become. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, simply refused to believe it. The only witnesses were a 14-year-old boy and Albus Dumbledore, and accepting their word meant accepting the end of everything comfortable. So the Ministry chose comfort and enforced the choice. The Daily Prophet spent a year mocking Harry as a disturbed attention seeker and Dumbledore as a senile schemer after Fudge's job, which meant the Order returned to war under conditions even worse than the first time. In the 1970s, they had at least fought alongside the Ministry. Now they worked against an enemy the government insisted did not exist, watched by a government that considered them the real threat. Every operation was doubly hidden, once from Voldemort and once from the law. They needed a headquarters, and the one they found is a story in itself. Sirius Black had spent his youth escaping a tall, gloomy townhouse at number 12, Grimmauld Place, in London, the ancestral home of the Black family, that fanatical bloodline that had disowned him for his blood traitor friends. Now his mother was dead, his brother was dead, and the last son of the House of Black inherited the building he hated most in the world. He gave it to the Order. There is a bleak comedy in that, which Sirius himself appreciated. The House of Toujours Pure, the family motto meaning always pure, became the war room of Muggle-borns, werewolves, and blood traitors. Dumbledore cast the Fidelius charm over it and made himself secret keeper, having learned the First War's hardest lesson, and members arrived for meetings by reading a slip of paper in his handwriting and watching a house squeeze itself into existence between number 11 and number 13, while the Muggle neighbours felt nothing but a draft. The house fought them the entire time. The portrait of Sirius's mother screamed abuse from behind moth-eaten curtains whenever the hall was disturbed. Doorknobs bit. A woven family tree covered one wall with small burn marks, where disowned relatives had been blasted off, Sirius among them. And through it all crept Creature, the ancient house elf of the Blacks, muttering insults into his loincloth, loyal to the screaming portrait and to the memory of better masters. The Order treated Creature as a nuisance, a bit of hostile furniture. Sirius, who had every reason to hate what Creature represented, was careless and contemptuous with him. Dumbledore warned against it. Indifference and neglect, he said later, often do more damage than outright dislike. Nobody listened, and the elf everyone ignored was listening to everything. File that away. Small cruelties in this story never stay small. The Second Order was a different creature from the first, and its roster tells you how the world had changed. The survivors of the photograph came back, greyer and fewer. Moody returned from a retirement that had curdled into paranoia, drinking only from his own hip flask, jumping at shadows, and freshly humiliated by the fact that a Death Eater had kept him locked in his own trunk for most of a school year while wearing his face by means of polyjuice potion. Remus Lupin came back, poorer than ever, since new legislation had made it nearly impossible for a werewolf to hold a job. Minerva McGonagall stood with the Order, as she always had, sharp and unbending. Hagrid returned. Elphius Doge, Daedalus Diggle, Emmeline Vance, Sturgis Podmore, the old names took their old seats. But the new blood mattered more. Kingsley Shacklebolt was a senior Auror, calm as deep water, with a slow, reassuring voice, and a mind quick enough to run the Ministry's official manhunt for Sirius Black, while secretly feeding the department false trails, since he knew exactly where Sirius was. He sat in meetings at the heart of magical law enforcement by day, and reported to the fugitives' kitchen by night. Nymphadora Tonks was the opposite pole, a young Auror barely out of training, clumsy enough to knock over the troll leg umbrella stand at headquarters almost every visit, with a gift so rare it appears perhaps once in a generation. She was a metamorph magus, able to change her appearance at will, no potion, no wand, just concentration and a screwed-up face. Her hair on an ordinary day was violently pink. She was also, through her mother, a Black, Sirius's cousin, one more piece of that poisonous family tree that had grown in a direction its ancestors would have despised. And there were the Weasleys. Arthur and Molly came into the Order together, and their arrival changed its centre of gravity because they brought a family with them. The Burrow became a safe house. The Weasley children, Bill working curse-breaking for Gringotts, Charlie recruiting foreign wizards abroad, the younger ones underage and furious about being excluded, grew up in the Order's orbit. Molly Weasley cooked for headquarters, scrubbed Grimmauld Place into something like habitability, and fought a running battle to keep the war away from the children, including Harry, which set her against Sirius in a quiet, grinding conflict over who had the greater claim on the boy, the godfather, or the woman who had mothered him by choice. Both were right, that was the problem, and beneath Molly's warmth ran a terror the others only glimpsed once, when a boggart in a Grimmauld Place desk turned into the dead bodies of her family, one after another, and she could not make it stop. She had lost her brothers to the First War, Gideon and Fabian of the photograph. She knew precisely what the Order asked of families, and she stayed anyway, and she brought her children to the table anyway when they came of age. Courage takes several shapes. Hers looked like a kitchen that always had room. Then there was Mundungus Fletcher, and every honest history has to hold its nose and include him. Dung was a petty criminal, a dealer in stolen cauldrons and cursed trinkets, who smelled of stale smoke and vanished whenever work was dangerous, which in the Order was always. Dumbledore kept him because Dung knew every crook in Britain, and the underworld hears things the respectable world never does. He was useful. He was also, as we will see, twice a disaster, once through cowardice and once through greed, and the second time cost the Order something beyond price. And there was Snape, of course, resuming the double life he had begun on that hilltop, returning to Voldemort's side hours after the rebirth with a story polished over 13 years, telling each master what the other allowed. Most of the Order loathed him, Sirius openly baited him at headquarters, two men trapped in a shared hatred left over from school, and Dumbledore's answer to every doubt was the same maddening sentence. I trust Severus Snape completely. He never said why. That refusal, noble and catastrophic at once, is perhaps Dumbledore's defining flaw, the belief that he could carry every secret alone and ration truth like medicine. The Order's first campaign of the Second War was not a battle, it was a guard shift. Deep in the Department of Mysteries, on a dusty shelf among thousands of glass spheres, sat the official record of Trelawney's prophecy, and Voldemort, rebuilt and cautious, wanted to hear the whole of it. The ending Snape never caught. The power the Dark Lord knows not. A prophecy can only be taken from its shelf by a person it concerns, which meant Voldemort or Harry, and Voldemort was not ready to be seen. So through the autumn and winter of 1995, Order members took turns standing invisible in that black corridor, night after tedious night, guarding a glass ball. Sturgis Podmore was caught by Ministry security while on duty, could not explain himself without exposing everything, and went to Azkaban for 6 months, the Order's first casualty of the Second War, lost to the awkward fact that they were policing a building that did not want them there. Then, just before Christmas, the corridor nearly killed Arthur Weasley. Voldemort had begun sending his enormous snake, Nagini, to scout the place, and on a December night, the snake found Arthur on guard and struck, again and again. He was saved by the strangest rescue in the Order's history. Far away at Hogwarts, Harry Potter, asleep in class hours earlier, and now asleep in his dormitory, dreamed the attack, and dreamed it from inside the body of the snake. He saw through its eyes. The fangs going into Arthur's flesh were his own. He woke screaming, and his account was so precise that Dumbledore acted on it instantly, and the rescuers reached Arthur in time. It saved a life and revealed a horror. The scar on Harry's forehead was a channel, a live connection into Voldemort's mind, and it ran in both directions. From that night, Dumbledore barely looked at Harry for months, would not meet his eyes across the Great Hall, fearing that Voldemort would notice the open door and step through it to attack Dumbledore through the boy. He was right to fear it. He was wrong, one more time, to explain nothing, because Voldemort did notice the door, and since he could not yet walk through it, he decided instead to send a dream. Before the dream came, the Order fought a different battle, the quiet one, and it is worth slowing down here, because the quiet year of 1995 and 96 shows better than any duel what membership actually meant. Consider a single week in the life of the Second Order. Kingsley Shacklebolt spends his days composing confidential reports on the whereabouts of Sirius Black, in which Sirius is reliably sighted in Tibet. Tonks pulls a double shift at the Ministry, then an overnight guarding the corridor, then reports to Grimmauld Place with her hair mouse brown from exhaustion, because even her gift dims when she is drained. Remus Lupin is underground again, sleeping in werewolf packs that despise wizards, eating what they eat, listening to Greyback's recruiters promise a world where the biters rule the bitten, and holding his cover so long between contacts that the Order sometimes has no idea if he is alive. Molly Weasley is feeding whoever stumbles in. Arthur is charming his way through the Ministry's back offices, gathering gossip like pollen. Snape is standing in a circle of masked murderers being asked, again and always with wands loose in nearby hands, what the old man at Hogwarts is planning, and answering with truth shaved so fine it works as a lie. Moody is at home, drawing up rotations, checking them for patterns an enemy could exploit, then checking his locks. Nobody in this picture is famous. Nobody is winning. They are holding a line no one else can see, and the country they are holding it for spends the same week reading newspaper columns about how Albus Dumbledore has lost his mind. Hogwarts itself, meanwhile, was being strangled. The Ministry, convinced Dumbledore was raising a private army against it, and unaware that in a manner of speaking he had already raised one twice, installed Dolores Umbridge at the school, first as a teacher, then as High Inquisitor, then, after driving Dumbledore out, as headmistress. Her regime banned practical defense lessons entirely. An entire generation of students was to be sent into a world containing Lord Voldemort, knowing the theory of a shield charm, and never once having cast it. The response to that policy became one of the strangest chapters in the Order's history, because the Order had nothing to do with it, and everything to do with it. A group of students, led by Harry, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley, formed a secret defense class in a hidden room, taught by Harry himself. They needed a name, and Ginny Weasley proposed one designed as a joke at the Ministry's expense. The Ministry feared Dumbledore's army. Very well, Dumbledore's army, 28 students signing a cursed parchment in a room that appeared only when needed, learning stunning spells and patronuses among the cushions. It looked like a school club. It was a succession plan, though none of them knew it. Within 3 years, the children on that parchment would be fighting and dying alongside the Order in open war, and several of them, Neville Longbottom above all, would hold the resistance together during the Order's darkest hour. The Phoenix, remember, is reborn from ashes, and the DA was the egg laid before the fire. When Dumbledore was finally cornered by the Minister himself over the group's existence, he performed one of his most cheerful pieces of theatre, claiming the army as his own, remarking that he had no intention of going to Azkaban, dropping the entire arrest party with a single move, and vanishing in a flash of flame with Fawkes, leaving the Minister to explain to the public how a 115-year-old man had escaped an office full of auras. Through that same spring, Voldemort probed the connection in Harry's scar with growing skill. Dumbledore had assigned Snape to teach the boy occlumency, the sealing of the mind, and the lessons failed as badly as any plan the Order ever made, because they required trust between two people who had none. Snape looked at Harry and saw James Potter, the tormentor of his school days, wearing Lily's eyes. Harry looked at Snape and saw a bully with unexplained authority. The lessons collapsed in fury. The door in Harry's mind stayed open, and in June, Voldemort sent through it the vision he had been crafting. He showed Harry a lie, shaped exactly like his worst fear. Sirius Black, captive in the Department of Mysteries, being tortured beside the shelves of glass spheres. The bait was designed with real understanding. Harry had one adult in the world who was his, and the vision put that adult under a curse and started a clock. Harry tried to verify it. That detail deserves rescue from the wreckage that followed, because he is often remembered as simply rushing in. He broke into Umbridge's office to use her fireplace, called Grimmauld Place, and reached only Creature, who told him, with the truth bent almost double, that his master had gone to the Department of Mysteries. Creature, the ignored elf, the hostile furniture. Sirius's cousin Narcissa Malfoy had found him months earlier, and the elf everyone had insulted had crept out and told the enemy everything he was not magically bound to keep, including exactly how to bait the trap, because the one thing Creature understood about Sirius Black was what he loved. Small cruelties never stay small. So 6 students flew to London on winged skeletal horses to rescue a man who was safe at home. What happened in the Department of Mysteries that night is usually called a battle, and by the end it was, but it began as a slow horror in the dark. The 6 found the corridor, the black door, the circular room whose walls spun. They found the shelf, row 97, and no Sirius, only a small glass sphere with Harry's name on a yellowed label, and the moment his hand closed on it, a dozen Death Eaters melted out of the darkness, Lucius Malfoy at their head, Bellatrix Lestrange laughing at his shoulder. The entire vision had been a lure for exactly this, a boy's hand on a prophecy only he could lift. What followed was 6 teenagers, the oldest 15, holding off 12 of Voldemort's inner circle, through room after impossible room, tanks of brains, a chamber of planets, shelves of time itself, and they were losing by degrees. Hermione cursed silent and badly hurt, Neville's nose broken, Ron's mind fogged, Ginny's ankle shattered, when the Order arrived. 5 of them came, Sirius, Lupin, Moody, Tonks, and Kingsley, alerted by Snape, who had understood Harry's coded warning in Umbridge's office, and, in the deepest irony of his double life, saved the godson of the man he hated by doing his actual job. The fight turned, and in the turning, in a chamber whose center held a raised stone archway hung with a tattered black veil, a veil that whispered, "The Order paid the knight's price." Sirius Black fought his way to his godson's side and dueled his own cousin Bellatrix beneath the arch, laughing, alive in combat, in a way 12 years of prison and 1 year of house arrest had denied him, and he taunted her, and her second curse took him full in the chest. He fell backward, and the veil swallowed him, and he did not come out the other side. There was no body. There is never a body with the veil. Remus Lupin, who had now lost every one of his friends, James, Lily, Peter, to treachery, and Sirius to the Arch, held Harry back from the archway with both arms, and said the sentence he had somehow kept ready. "There is nothing you can do. He is gone." The night was not finished. Bellatrix fled, Harry chased her into the Ministry's atrium, and Voldemort himself came at last, stepping out of the air to finish the prophecy's work in person, and found instead the one wizard he had ever feared rising between him and the boy. The duel between Dumbledore and Voldemort in the Ministry atrium was witnessed, finally, by the Minister for Magic and half the Night Staff. Golden shields and water made rope, and fire made serpent, and it ended with Voldemort attempting one last weapon. He possessed Harry, poured himself into the open scar, and dared Dumbledore from inside the boy's own mouth to kill them both. What drove him out was the same power that had unmade him at Godric's Hollow, the thing he knew not. Harry, broken open with grief for Sirius, minutes old, felt it fill his whole body, and Voldemort could not bear to inhabit a soul in that condition. Love hurt him, he fled, and Cornelius Fudge, standing in the rubble in his nightshirt, said the words the Order had waited a year to hear. "He is back." Vindication tasted like ash. The Order had been proven right about everything, and the proof had cost them Sirius Black and very nearly 6 children. The Ministry reversed itself overnight, with the shamelessness only governments manage. The same newspaper that had spent a year calling Harry deluded now called him the chosen one, and Fudge was gone within weeks, replaced by Rufus Scrimgeour, a former head of the Auror office, a lion of a man who at least understood there was a war. But the Order's relationship with the new Ministry stayed cold. Scrimgeour wanted Harry photographed visiting the Ministry, a mascot for morale, and wanted Dumbledore's secrets as the price of cooperation, and got neither. The two sides fought the same enemy separately, which suited Voldemort perfectly. And now the war turned dark in earnest, because Voldemort no longer needed to hide. The summer of 1996 brought the Wizarding War into Muggle Britain. A bridge in London was torn from its moorings in broad daylight, killing dozens. Giants, recruited at last, walked through West Country towns behind hurricanes that no weather report could explain. Fog lay over the country for weeks, the breeding of Dementors, now openly loose from Azkaban and feeding where they liked, and the Order's own people began to fall in the streets. Emmeline Vance, the stately witch of the old photograph, was murdered near Downing Street itself, and her death was mentioned to the Muggle Prime Minister as a curiosity. Amelia Bones, head of magical law enforcement, aunt of a girl in Dumbledore's army, and sister of the Order's murdered Edgar Bones, died dueling Voldemort in person, alone in her locked house. He had come for her the way he had once come for Dorcas Meadows, and that family had now given 3 generations to the same enemy. Sturgis Podmore's name faded from the record. Karkaroff, a Death Eater who had run, was found dead in a shack with the dark mark over it, and Moody's only comment was that he was surprised the man had lasted a year. This was the arithmetic of the Second War. The First War's survivors had spent 13 years learning to sleep again, and the list was growing once more, and everyone at the Grimmauld Place table could feel it reaching for them. Dumbledore, meanwhile, was dying, and told no one. That is the great hidden spine of the war's final year, the secret under all the other secrets. Over the summer he had traced one of Voldemort's soul anchors, the ring of Marvolo Gaunt, to the ruin of the Gaunt Shack, and the ring carried a curse worthy of its maker, and Dumbledore, seeing something set into the ring that spoke to the oldest grief of his own life, forgot for one fatal moment that it was a trap, and put it on. The curse killed his hand instantly, a dead blackened thing at the end of his sleeve, and began moving up the arm. Snape's skill caged it, and Snape's honesty priced it. "A year," he said, "perhaps less." And so every plan Dumbledore made from that point forward was made by a man checking a clock only he and Snape could see, and this is the key that unlocks his strangest year, the year he spent giving private lessons to Harry Potter in a memory basin, instead of teaching him spells, walking the boy backward through Tom Riddle's life, the orphanage, the diary, the locket, the cup, the diadem, the snake, teaching him not how to fight Voldemort, but how to understand what Voldemort had done to himself, because the knowledge was the inheritance, and the teacher would not be there for the war. It is also the key to the war's most misunderstood death. In the spring, Dumbledore extracted from Snape the completion of a bargain begun months before. Voldemort had assigned Draco Malfoy, 16 years old, the task of murdering Albus Dumbledore, a task designed to fail and to punish the boy's father through the failure. Snape had sworn an unbreakable vow to Draco's desperate mother to finish the job if the boy could not. Dumbledore, already dying, saw the whole board at once. If Draco failed and lived, Voldemort would kill him. If Snape refused the vow's demand, the vow would kill Snape, and with Snape would die the Order's only eyes inside the enemy's mind, and something else besides. A final secret Snape was carrying that could not be allowed to die with him. And so Dumbledore asked of Severus Snape the hardest service of his double life. When the moment comes, he said, it must be you. Let the old man die on his own terms, quickly and without degradation. Save the boy's soul from murder, and buy with the act a currency nothing else could purchase, Voldemort's absolute trust. Snape's answer, after everything, was to ask whether Dumbledore intended him to do it now, and their last arguments on the subject were bitter, but he agreed. 2 men held that secret. It went to the tower with them. The end came in June, on a night when Dumbledore was away from the school with Harry, hunting another piece of Voldemort's soul in a cave by the sea. What the cave took from him, the potion of despair he drank basin by basin, while Harry forced it into him, because he had made the boy swear to, left him barely standing. They returned to Hogsmeade to find the dark mark burning green over the astronomy tower. Draco Malfoy had done what no one believed he could, mended a vanishing cabinet, and let Death Eaters into Hogwarts itself for the first time in its history. The Order was already fighting them in the corridors below. Dumbledore's last act of magic was not a curse. With his strength nearly gone, and Death Eaters on the stairs, he spent his final second freezing Harry, invisible against the wall, so the boy could not intervene and die. He faced Draco wandless and talked to him, gently, about mercy and hiding his family, and was very close to bringing him across when the others burst onto the tower, and then Snape, and Dumbledore said, please. Those who heard it thought he was begging for his life. He was begging for his death, calling in the promise. The curse was green, and the fall was long, and the phoenix that had given the Order its name sang one lament over the grounds, and left Hogwarts forever. And everyone who loved Albus Dumbledore, including the man who killed him, believed something different about that tower, and only one of them believed the truth, and he could tell no one at all. The White Tomb by the lake was the only one of its kind. No headmaster of Hogwarts had ever been buried on the grounds before, and none has been since. The funeral drew everyone, the ministry delegations, and the mer-people singing under the water, and the centaurs firing arrows into the air from the tree line. A whole society mourning the man it had spent the previous 2 years slandering, and in the middle of it sat the Order of the Phoenix, learning what an organization feels like the day after it loses its secret keeper, its strategist, its recruiter, and its reason all at once. Because Dumbledore had been all of those things, and by design he had been them alone, the Fidelius charm on Grimmauld Place fractured with his death, its secret now held by everyone he had ever told, including, as far as anyone knew, the Death Eater who had killed him and had spent years walking in and out of headquarters. The house was abandoned. The network of safe knowledge in Dumbledore's head, which member could be trusted with which task, which contact in which department owed which favor, was simply gone. Moody took over what could be taken over, because someone had to, and Moody was the last of the old iron. But even he said aloud what everyone was thinking. Dumbledore had carried the map of the war in his own skull, and he had burned it rather than risk it, and the Order would now fight blind. Worse, they would fight while guarding a boy who could not stay guarded. The blood protection on the Dursley house, the charm Dumbledore had purchased with Harry's lonely childhood, expired forever the moment Harry turned 17, the age of majority. The whole enemy knew the date. The last week of July 1997 was therefore a deadline written in the sky, and the Order's answer to it became the most famous single operation in its history, and the costliest hour it ever spent. The plan was Moody's, with a twist supplied by Mundungus Fletcher of all people, and it was pure mad-eye, layered, paranoid, and built on the assumption that they were already betrayed. The Ministry, a month from falling and riddled with the enemy, could not be told. The Flu Network, the apparition system, every civilized way to travel was being watched, so the Order would do it the old way, on brooms and enchanted vehicles, in the open air, and because Voldemort's people would be waiting for a single boy under guard, there would be no single boy. 6 members of the Order and Dumbledore's army took Polyjuice Potion in the Dursleys' scrubbed kitchen, and 6 identical Harry Potters stood up from the table. Ron, Hermione, Fred, George, Fleur Delacour, and Mundungus, each paired with a protector, each pair bound for a different safe house. 7 parties scattering in 7 directions, so that the watchers in the dark could not know which Potter was real. The real Harry rode in the sidecar of a flying motorbike that had once belonged to Sirius Black, and the man driving it was Hagrid, who had carried Harry away from the ruin of Godric's Hollow on that same motorbike 16 years before. The Order did not plan that symmetry. The war simply rhymed that way, and no one had the heart to mention it. They rose from Privet Drive into an ambush of more than 30 Death Eaters, not a patrol. The full strength of the enemy, waiting in the clouds, because the Order's plan had been sold in advance, and the seller was not a traitor at the table this time, but something harder to guard against, a broken man. Snape had passed the true date to Voldemort, as Dumbledore's plan required him to, protecting his cover with information the enemy would get anyway. But the detail of the 7 Potters held, the confusion was real, and the sky over southern England that night filled with green fire as 7 running battles tore off in 7 directions. Hedwig, the snowy owl who had been Harry's first friend in the magical world, died in her cage in the first seconds, killed by a curse meant for him. George Weasley, flying as Harry beside Remus Lupin, took a dark curse that sheared his ear from his head, a wound that would never fully heal, because Sectum Sempra leaves nothing for magic to regrow, and there is a long bitterness folded into that spell's history, because the curse was Snape's own invention, and Snape himself had cast it, aiming for the wand hand of a Death Eater, about to kill Lupin, and hitting the boy instead. He maimed one of the children he was sworn to protect, saving the life of a man who hated him. That was the shape of Snape's war. Every good deed wore the enemy's face, and Voldemort himself came into the sky. He had reserved the real Harry for his own wand, and when the Watchers identified the true target, he flew, wandless of broom, smoke on the wind, and ran the motorbike down over the dark country. What saved Harry that night was nothing the Order planned. His wand, brother to Voldemort's, acted of its own accord, a piece of deep magic no one fully understood, and blasted through the borrowed wand Voldemort was using, and the Dark Lord fell back screaming in rage, and the motorbike crashed over the boundary of a safe house and into a muddy garden, and Hagrid and Harry lived. Mad-Eye Moody did not. He had taken the most dangerous pairing for himself, flying guard on Mundungus Fletcher, precisely because he trusted Dung least, and when Voldemort first burst through the clouds toward their pair, Mundungus took one look at the Dark Lord's face and disapparated, vanishing in blind panic and leaving his protector alone in the open sky. Voldemort's curse took Moody full in the face. He fell, they later calculated, the better part of a mile. The Order searched for the body when the survivors regrouped, Bill Weasley and Lupin going out into enemy skies the same night, and found nothing. The Death Eaters had taken it. Months later, Harry would find Moody's magical eye set into the office door of a ministry torturer, being used to spy on subordinates, and he would steal it back and bury it under a tree, the only funeral Alastor Moody ever got. Sit with him a moment, because the Order was never the same afterward, and it is right to mark the man. Moody had fought in both wars from the first day of each. He had filled Azkaban and kept his prisoners alive on principle. Half the Aurors who ever amounted to anything had trained under him. He was scarred, one-legged, one-eyed, paranoid past the edge of comedy, a man who ate only what he had prepared himself and saw plots in birthday presents. And every single one of his paranoias had been purchased with a wound, and the night he died, he was proven right one last time, because the mission had indeed been betrayed, and the weak link had indeed been exactly the man he had chosen to watch personally. Constant vigilance, he had barked at a generation of students. He died practicing it, guarding the coward, in the highest risk seat of a plan built to spend his life before the children's. The survivors gathered in the Burrows' kitchen that night, and Bill poured out fire whiskey, and the toast was 2 words: Mad-Eye. Even then there was no time to mourn. Moody's fall meant a captured corpse, a magical eye in enemy hands, and every secret his body might be made to give up, and the Order spent the rest of the night moving safe houses. That is how their grief always worked. It came due, and they paid in logistics. 4 days later the government fell, It fell the way the Order had always privately predicted, quietly, from the inside, with the lights on. There was no battle for the Ministry of Magic. Rufus Scrimgeour was taken and tortured for Harry Potter's whereabouts, and the Lion of the Auror office, who had spent his short ministry demanding Harry's cooperation and getting nothing, gave the enemy nothing either, and died protecting a boy he had never once managed to have a civil conversation with. His death bought hours, and the Order needed every one of them, because the coup came on the 1st of August, in the middle of a wedding. Bill Weasley married Fleur Delacour under a golden marquee at the Burrow, and half the surviving Order was there in dress robes, and for one afternoon there was music and champagne, and an old man in a moth-eaten fez telling stories, and it is one of the small mercies of this history that the Order got that afternoon, because they never got another. At dusk, a lynx made of silver light landed in the middle of the dance floor, a Patronus, Dumbledore's old invention, carrying Kingsley Shacklebolt's slow, deep voice, and the voice said, "The Ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming." The protective enchantments around the wedding, tied to the Ministry's authority, died with the government, and Death Eaters cracked out of the air among the wedding guests within seconds of the warning. Kingsley's lynx was the difference between a raid and a massacre. The trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, vanished from the dance floor into Muggle London and out of the Order's reach, and that is a piece of the story that must be understood clearly to understand the Order's final year. Dumbledore had left Harry a mission, the hunt for the fragments of Voldemort's soul, and had ordered him to reveal it to no one but Ron and Hermione, and to keep it from the Order and from everyone else alike. So from that night, the Order of the Phoenix fought a war in defense of a plan it was not allowed to know, guarding the movements of 3 teenagers who could not tell them where they were going or why. Molly Weasley raged at the secrecy. Lupin raged at it. It held anyway, because Dumbledore had asked, and because the Order's whole architecture had always run on exactly this, on trusting the dead man's judgment past the point of reason. The occupied country they now moved through deserves description, because the Order's second incarnation had fought a hidden war under a blind government, and its third incarnation, the rump that survived August, fought under something far worse, a hostile one. Voldemort never took the minister's office himself. He preferred a puppet, a cursed official named Pius Thickness, and the machinery of the state simply rotated under new management. The same desks, the same forms, new purposes. A Muggle-born registration commission was established under Dolores Umbridge, she of the pink cardigans and the educational decrees, now sitting in a courtroom with a stolen locket at her throat, trying witches and wizards for the crime of existing. The charge was theft of magic. The sentence was Azkaban, or worse, and the Dementors that had once guarded the prison now attended the trials, breeding in the national despair. Snatchers, licensed gangs of bounty hunters, swept the countryside for Muggle-borns and blood traitors on the run. The Daily Prophet printed the new truth. Hogwarts attendance became compulsory, with Snape installed as headmaster, and 2 Death Eaters, the Carrow siblings, teaching the Cruciatus Curse to children by having them practice on other children. Harry Potter's face was on posters, undesirable number 1, with a price of 200,000 galleons. Against all of that, the Order had perhaps a few dozen people, no headquarters, no leader, and no legal existence. And this is, strangely, the chapter of its history where it may have mattered most, because the Order stopped being an organization that year and became something harder to kill. It became a behavior. Safe houses chained across the country, the Burrow watched but defiant, Bill and Fleur's cottage on the cliffs, Aunt Muriel's house under a Fidelius, the Tonks family home until it was no longer safe. Ted Tonks, Nymphadora's Muggle-born father, refused to register and went on the run across country with a goblin named Griphook and a Muggle-born wizard named Dirk Cresswell, and their small fugitive band was one of hundreds, sleeping in woods, robbing chicken coops, listening at night for the crack of apparition. Ted Tonks did not survive the winter. The Snatchers caught the group and he died fighting, a kind, unremarkable man who had married a black and laughed about it, and whose grandson would be born weeks later and never meet him. And the Order took to the air, in the most literal sense, somewhere in the occupied country, at a location that changed constantly and could only be found with a rotating password. Lee Jordan, late of Dumbledore's army, and the Hogwarts Quidditch commentary box, set up a pirate radio program called Potter Watch. Kingsley came on under the codename Royal, Lupin came on as Romulus, Fred Weasley traded the passwords out over the airwaves, with jokes barely dry from the grave situation, and week after week the program did the one thing the enemy's whole apparatus could not stop. It said names. The Daily Prophet did not report murdered muggles or vanished families, so Potter Watch read the lists aloud, asked a minute of silence, and reminded a terrorized population, in Kingsley's steady voice, that every muggle life was worth protecting, and that Harry Potter was still alive. That last item was the program's whole strategy, in 4 words. They could offer no armies and no rescue. They could only keep a single fact burning in the dark, that the boy the regime most wanted dead was still out there, still uncaught, and as long as that was true, the story was not over. Hope, rationed out over illegal radio, at a rate of 1 broadcast whenever they could manage it. It is not the kind of warfare that gets statues built. It won the war as surely as any duel. While the Order broadcast and hid and buried its dead, the 3 it was forbidden to help were living out a secret history that touches our story at one strange, redemptive point, and the point is Kreacher. The trio, hunting the fragments of Voldemort's soul, returned briefly to abandoned Grimmauld Place, and there they finally asked the hostile furniture a question, and the answer reordered everything the Order thought it knew about the house it had used and the elf it had ignored. Years before the Second War, Voldemort had needed a house elf for an hour, some disposable creature to test the defenses of the sea cave, where he intended to hide a piece of his soul. Regulus Black, Sirius's younger brother, the good son, the Death Eater son, volunteered his family's elf, honored to serve. Voldemort took Kreacher to the cave, forced the potion of despair down his throat basin by basin to prove the defenses worked, dropped the locket into the emptied stone bowl, and left the elf to die on the island, as the water's dead things dragged him under. What Voldemort did not understand, because he had never once in his life thought about it, was that house elf magic runs on orders, and Regulus had ordered Kreacher to come home. So Kreacher came home, through wards the darkest wizard alive believed impassable, and told his young master everything. And Regulus Black, 18 years old, raised on every poisonous idea his house could teach, understood at last what he had joined, and chose. He ordered Kreacher to take him back to the cave. He drank the potion himself this time, every basin of it, screaming, so that the elf would not have to, swapped the locket for a fake containing a note that told the Dark Lord to his face that he would be mortal again, gave Kreacher 2 final orders, destroy the real locket and never tell the family, and then, past speech, dying of thirst from the potion's design, he drank from the lake, and the dead things in the water took him. No body, no witness, no glory. The Order never knew. Sirius went to his own death, believing his brother had died a coward begging out of Voldemort's service, and Kreacher had spent 17 years failing to destroy an indestructible object, forbidden by his last order from telling anyone why he wept over it, going quietly mad in a house that emptied around him. When Harry heard the story, he did something no one in the Order had ever done. He gave Kreacher the fake locket, Regulus's locket, as a keepsake, and spoke to him about his dead master with respect. The change was total. The elf who had betrayed Sirius to the enemy became fiercely, tearfully loyal, and months later, in the last hour of the war, Kreacher would lead the house elves of Hogwarts up from the kitchens into open battle, carving knives in hand, shrieking Regulus's name as a battle cry. Small kindnesses, it turns out, do not stay small either. The Order's darkest hour was full of allies it had earned without noticing, and haunted by allies it had failed to earn. Snape's year as headmaster is the mirrored version of the same lesson, a man doing constant good that had to look exactly like evil. From the headmaster's office, under the portraits of his predecessors, he governed a Hogwarts he had handed to the Carrows, and the school hated him with a purity it had never managed for Umbridge, because Umbridge had merely been a tyrant, while Snape was the man who had murdered Dumbledore in that very tower and taken his chair. What the school could not see was the office door closing at night, and the portrait of Albus Dumbledore waking in its frame, and the two of them continuing the war's longest partnership. Snape steered punishments toward Hagrid's detentions in the forest, which were no punishments at all, and away from the Carrows' chains. When Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood were caught trying to steal the sword of Gryffindor from his office, an offence that under the Carrows meant torture, the headmaster sentenced them to an evening in the forbidden forest with the gamekeeper. The school called it luck. It was policy, and when the portrait told him the time had come to deliver the real sword to Harry, who was camped in a frozen forest hundreds of miles away and could not be approached or seen, Snape carried it out with the tradecraft of a man who had survived 17 years of double life. He placed the sword in an iced-over pool, where it could only be reached through an act of true courage, as the sword's own magic demanded, and he sent his Patronus ahead through the trees as a guide, and then he left without being seen, as instructed, by a boy who would have killed him on sight. His Patronus was a silver doe. Hold that image in the dark of the forest for a moment, because it is the whole man in a single spell. A Patronus takes the shape of the soul's deepest anchor, and it cannot be faked, which is exactly why the Order had always used them as messengers. Lily Potter's Patronus had been a doe. 20 years after her death, the man who had loved her since childhood, who had caused her death with a carried prophecy, and spent every day since in unpayable debt, still threw her shape in silver light when he summoned his happiest memory, because his happiest memory had never stopped being her. Harry followed the doe without knowing why he trusted it, feeling only that it was somehow familiar, and it led him to the sword that would destroy the locket, and its caster walked away through the snow to go on being the most hated man in Britain. Dumbledore had once asked him, after all this time. Always, Snape said. The Order fought its war on trust in one another. Snape fought his entirely alone, on trust in 2 dead people and a portrait. Inside the occupied school, meanwhile, the Phoenix was hatching again, exactly as it had before, in the generation nobody was watching. Neville Longbottom, the boy of the sweet wrappers, the other child of the prophecy, the student the war had overlooked twice, reconvened Dumbledore's army, and this time, it was no club. With Harry gone, and Ginny and Luna eventually gone too, Luna dragged off the Hogwarts Express at Christmas, by Death Eaters, wanting a hold over her father's newspaper. Ginny kept home after Easter, when the family's cover finally broke. Neville ended the year running the Resistance alone, and running it from inside a wound. The Carrows had understood eventually that the Longbottom boy was the root of their troubles, and they carved lessons into him, and each mark made him larger to the students watching. He hid the hunted in the room of requirement, which had sealed itself into a permanent sanctuary that the Carrows could not enter. Hammocks slung from the ceiling in house colours, a portrait hole passage running under the hills to food and news, and by spring, the room held dozens of students the regime listed as missing. The passage's far end came up in a pub in Hogsmeade. The pub was the Hog's Head. The barman feeding and sheltering the child resistance of the Second War was the same man who had thrown Snape out of that upstairs room in the first one, and it is finally time to tell his story properly, because the Order of the Phoenix began in his building, ended in his building, and never really knew him. Aberforth Dumbledore had spent a century being the other brother, and preferring it. Where Albus collected prizes and languages and correspondence across Europe, Aberforth liked goats, fistfights, and being left alone, and the distance between the brothers was not temperament, but a grave. They had had a sister. Ariana Dumbledore was 6 years old when a group of Muggle boys saw her practicing magic she could not yet control, and what they did to her when she could not show them the trick again broke something in her permanently. Her magic turned inward and volcanic, flaring out in destructive bursts she could neither summon nor stop. Their father went to Azkaban for what he did to those boys, and died there. Their mother kept Ariana hidden and safe for years, until one of the eruptions killed her. And Albus, 18, brilliant, newly graduated, and newly famous, came home to a ruined family and a caretaking duty he quietly resented. And that summer, a beautiful, brilliant, terrible boy named Gellert Grindelwald arrived in the village, and the two of them fell into each other's minds. And, the record obliges honesty here, Albus fell further than that, and they spent 2 months planning benevolent conquest of the world, wizards ruling muggles for their own good, and the plans had no room in them for a broken sister. Aberforth, who had always been the one Ariana was calmest with, who fed her and settled her, confronted them. It became a duel. 3 young men, and Grindelwald used the Cruciatus curse on Aberforth, and Ariana, 14 now, came apart in the middle of it trying to help, and when the light cleared she was dead on the floor, and no one ever knew whose curse had done it. Grindelwald fled the country within the hour. Albus carried the not knowing for the rest of his life, and Aberforth broke his brother's nose at the funeral, and the famous crooked nose in every photograph of the great Albus Dumbledore was his brother's grief, set badly on purpose, or never set at all. That is the man who poured drinks under the Order's first meetings, whose mirror shard passed Harry's cries for help out of a cellar years later, whose pub fed the student underground, and who, on the last night of the war, stood in a room with Harry Potter and tried with genuine kindness to talk him out of dying for Albus's plan, because Aberforth had watched his brother's plans consume one child already. Secrets, he said, and lies, that is how we grew up, and Albus was a natural. The bitterness had 100 years of compound interest on it, and then Harry answered him, and the answer is one of the hinges of the whole story. He said that sometimes he had hated Dumbledore too, out there in the tent, in the cold, following instructions that came with no reasons, and he said he was going to keep following them anyway, because the alternative was Voldemort, and because trust extended past the grave was the only kind the dead can use. Aberforth looked at the boy for a long moment, and then the portrait of Ariana that hung over his mantle, the sister at the center of everything, turned and walked away down the painted tunnel behind her, and came back leading Neville Longbottom, bruised, beaming, through the passage into the light. The last door into Hogwarts opened through a dead girl's portrait in her brother's bar. The Order of the Phoenix never planned its symbols. It grew them. What happened next happened fast, the way dams break. Harry had come back for one of the last fragments of Voldemort's soul, hidden somewhere in the castle, and Voldemort knew within the hour that he was there, and both sides called everyone. Through the portrait passage, summoned by the old enchanted coins of Dumbledore's army, came the scattered generation, Dean Thomas and Seamus Finnegan, Cho Chang, the Patil twins, Colin Creevey, who was Muggle-born and 16 and had been in hiding all year and was expressly ordered away and came back in anyway. And behind them came the Order, the whole surviving Order, Kingsley and Lupin, Arthur and Molly with Bill and Fleur and Charlie coming, Percy Weasley arriving mid-crisis with an apology years overdue, the family whole again for exactly 1 hour. McGonagall took the castle back in minutes, dueling Snape through the corridors until he fled through a window, though fled is the school's word, and escaped on schedule might be the truthful one, and then she did the thing she had waited her whole career to do. She raised the castle itself. Desks marched. Statues and suits of armor stepped down from their plinths at her command, 100 stone knights shaking the floors, and the teachers wove shield magic over the towers, while the students of age lined the walls, and the youngest were evacuated down Ariana's passage, and the Order of the Phoenix, the tiny secret club that had spent 2 decades meeting in back rooms, found itself at last with an army, and the army was everyone its members had ever taught, raised, rescued, or fed. Voldemort gave the castle until midnight to hand over Harry Potter, and the castle declined, and the Battle of Hogwarts began under a cold May sky, giants at the walls, acromantulas flooding from the forest, dementors drifting at the edges, and curses coming through the shield dome like rain through a failing roof. It would be told afterward as a single night, but the people inside it experienced something with no shape at all. Corridor fights and collapsing stairwells, and the castle's own knights grappling with giants in the courtyards. And it is in that shapelessness that the Order paid its final price. So we will slow down, as this channel always does, and take the losses one at a time, because a list is not a memorial, and these people have earned better than a list. Fred Weasley died beside his brother Percy, and the cruelty of the moment has a precision to it that still catches people 25 years of retellings later. Percy, the family's stiff, striving, estranged third son, had walked out on them over politics and pride, and had just fought his way back, and mid-battle he cracked a joke, his first in years, announcing his resignation from the puppet ministry while dueling its minister. Fred, the family's laughter made flesh, turned to him with pure delight. "You actually are joking, Perce." Those were the last words, said through a grin, and then the corridor wall came down under a curse blast, and when the dust settled, Fred was gone with the ghost of that laugh still on his face. Percy would not leave the body. George, on the far side of the castle, did not yet know that the mirror of his whole life had broken. The family that had been whole for 1 hour was never whole again, and for the rest of his days, George Weasley could not produce a Patronus, because the charm requires a happy memory, and every happy memory he owned had Fred in it. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks died in the same hour, close enough together that no account settles which fell first. Their marriage was itself a small war story. Tonks had chosen him plainly, and Lupin, 13 years her senior, poor and a werewolf, had spent a year retreating from his own happiness, insisting she deserved someone whole, going so far, in the darkest stretch after their son was conceived, as to try to abandon his family for the hunt for the soul fragments, believing his child would be better off unfathered than fathered by his kind. Harry, an actual orphan, had thrown that offer back in his face with a fury that ended the friendship for a season, and it was the making of Lupin, who went home. Their son Edward, called Teddy, was born in April, with hair that changed colour in his first hour of life, his mother's gift, and Lupin arrived at the safe house to announce it luminous, with a joy no one had ever seen on him, and asked Harry to be godfather, the last of the marauders passing the role Sirius had held to the boy Sirius had held it for. Teddy Lupin was 5 weeks old on the night of the battle. His parents left him with his grandmother and went, because the order did not have members to spare, and had never once in its history asked whether a sacrifice was fair. They were found afterward lying near each other in the great hall, peaceful, as if asleep, and every telling of this story is contractually obligated to notice what their deaths made. 20 years after Godric's Hollow, the war ended as it began, with a boy orphaned in his first year of life, raised by others, his parents' names spoken to him like heirlooms. The difference, the entire difference the Order of the Phoenix ever fought for, is that Teddy Lupin grew up beloved, in a world at peace, with a godfather who came for him constantly, and no cupboard anywhere in his childhood. Colin Creevey died holding a wand he was legally forbidden to own, in a battle he had been evacuated from, 16 years old, the smallest body carried into the Great Hall. Lavender Brown was savaged by Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who had made Lupin what he was, and by most accounts did not survive him. Severus Snape died in the boathouse by the lake, and his death is the war's blackest irony, because Voldemort killed him for a mistake. The Elder Wand, the death stick of legend that Voldemort had torn from Dumbledore's tomb, would not perform for its new master, and Voldemort reasoned that the wand's true allegiance must belong to the man who had killed its previous owner, to Snape, loyal Snape, and so, with something almost like regret, he set the snake on him, and left him to bleed out on the boathouse floor. He was wrong about the wand, wrong in a way that would kill him within the hour, and wrong about the man, wrong in a way 17 years deep. Harry, hidden feet away, watched him die, and Snape, with the last minutes of his life, pulled from himself the silver threads of memory that were the only proof he had, and said, "Look at me," and died, holding the gaze of Lily Potter's eyes in her son's face. What those memories showed Harry in the headmaster's office minutes later has run under this entire story like a river under a city, and here it surfaces. The hilltop, the doe, the anything, the plan for the tower, all of it, and one thing more, the last secret, the one Dumbledore had kept even from Harry, entrusting it only to the man everyone hated, because only that man was certain to be believed by no one. On the night the killing curse rebounded in Godric's Hollow, a fragment of Voldemort's shattered soul had fled into the only living thing left in the nursery. The scar had never been just a scar. The connection had never been just a connection. Harry Potter was himself an unintended vessel of the enemy's soul, and while that fragment lived in him, Voldemort could not die, and so the boy the Order had guarded for 17 years, at the price of the Potters, and Sirius, and Moody, and Dumbledore, and all the rest, had been protected all along for this, to learn, at the correct hour, and not before, that he had to walk into the forest and let Voldemort kill him. Dumbledore's ration truth, one final ration. Snape himself had recoiled from it when the portrait first told him, accusing Dumbledore of raising the boy like a pig for slaughter, and the accusation was the one moment the two men's long partnership nearly broke, and it stands in the record, unresolved, for every listener to weigh in the dark. Harry weighed it for the length of one walk. He told no one, exactly as Dumbledore had modelled all his life, and went down through the fighting under the invisibility cloak, past Neville, to whom he left one instruction, kill the snake, and into the forest, where his parents' war had started before he could speak. The stone from the golden snitch opened at the end, Dumbledore's final gift, and the dead walked with him, James and Lily, Sirius, Lupin, an hour into his own death, not carrying him, just keeping him company, which was all they had ever been able to do. He let Voldemort cast the curse without raising his wand, and the old deep magic that had been the Order's silent partner from the first page turned over one last time, because Voldemort had rebuilt his body with Harry's blood, and Lily's protection lived in that blood, and so her sacrifice now tethered her son to life from inside the enemy's own veins. The curse killed the fragment and left the boy. Voldemort had unmade himself in the graveyard 3 years early and never known it. Harry woke face down in the leaves, alive, uncoupled at last from the thing in his scar, and chose to lie still and let the enemy believe. Hagrid carried the body back. Voldemort chose that detail deliberately, forcing the weeping half-giant, captured earlier in the battle, to bear Harry Potter in his arms at the head of the victory procession, and the defenders came out onto the shattered steps to the sight of the one thing that could break them. Some screamed. McGonagall's scream is described by those who heard it as worse than a curse, the sound of a woman watching her third war end wrong. And Voldemort, master of the moment as he believed, made the invitation tyrants always make, "Join me or die," and out of the crowd of the defeated, limping, alone, walked Neville Longbottom, and refused. Voldemort, in a mood to make an example rather than a corpse, summoned the ancient sorting hat from the castle, jammed it burning onto the boy's head, and told the crowd there would be no more houses, no more sorting, and the frayed old hat did the last thing anyone expected, including, one suspects, Voldemort. It gave Neville the sword of Godric Gryffindor, which presents itself out of the hat's depths to any true Gryffindor in need, as it had for Harry in a chamber under the school 6 years before, dropped its ruby hilt into the burning boy's hand, and Neville Longbottom, son of Frank and Alice, keeper of the sweet wrappers, the other child of the prophecy, drew it in a single motion and took the head off Nagini the snake, the last vessel of Voldemort's soul left on Earth. And in that same instant, Harry moved under the cloak, and the war's last hour broke open in every direction at once. They came from everywhere in that hour, everyone the story had planted, Charlie Weasley over the hill at the head of the reinforcements, with Horace Slughorn puffing beside him, leading what looked like the families of every Hogsmeade villager and half the country besides. The centaurs, who had refused the war as wizard business, charging out of their own forest with bows singing, shamed or moved at last. Firenze the exile already wounded among the defenders. Grawp, Hagrid's small giant of a half-brother, wading into the enemy's giants. The Thestrals and the Hippogriff Buckbeak, once condemned to death by this same ministry, tearing at the giant's eyes. And up from the kitchens, the house elves of Hogwarts, hundreds of them, led by a bent, ancient elf with a locket bouncing on his chest, creature of the House of Black, roaring the battle cry no one present could fully have understood. "Fight! Fight for my master, the defender of house elves! Fight in the name of brave Regulus!" The elves went for the enemy's legs with kitchen knives, and it is recorded without shame in every account that Death Eaters fell screaming under carving blades held by the creatures the wizarding world had owned, ignored, and insulted for 1,000 years. The Order of the Phoenix had never managed to win its war among wizards alone. It won the moment the war stopped being a wizard's war. Bellatrix Lestrange outlived her master's other lieutenants by minutes, dueling 3 schoolgirls at once, Hermione, Luna, and Ginny, laughing at them, and a killing curse of hers missed Ginny Weasley by the width of a hand. What happened next entered the language of wizarding Britain permanently. Molly Weasley, mother of 7, knitter of jumpers, boggart haunted by exactly this, threw off her travelling cloak and came for the most dangerous woman alive, shouting a sentence this channel will soften to, "Not my daughter," and the word she placed in the middle of it was not soft at all. The hall stopped to watch. Bellatrix laughed at her, the housewife, and taunted her about Fred, dead a few hours, and Molly's answer, "You will never touch our children again," arrived with a curse under it that caught Bellatrix over the heart mid-laugh, and the last and worst of the First War's monsters, the torturer of the Longbottoms, the killer of Sirius Black, toppled with the laugh still curdling on her face. Voldemort's scream of rage blew his 3 remaining duelists off their feet, and his killing rage turned on Molly Weasley, and between the mother and the monster, the invisibility cloak finally came off. The last duel of the war was, in the end, a conversation. Harry and Voldemort circled each other alone in the Great Hall at sunrise, while the whole world watched from the walls. and Harry spent it giving his enemy something no one had ever offered Tom Riddle in his life: the truth and a chance. He told him about Snape, the whole 17 years of it, watched the certainty crack. Then came the forest, the blood, why none of the defenders could be touched this morning, why every curse Voldemort had thrown since dawn had failed to stick, because a boy had died for this crowd, as a mother had once died for a boy, and the old magic had settled over all of them, like the shield it was. He told him the Elder Wand had never been Snape's to yield. Dumbledore's death had been arranged with Snape in advance, a planned end, and the wand knew it, and its allegiance had passed instead to the last person who had ever defeated Dumbledore, in any sense the wand recognized, the boy who had disarmed him on the tower, Draco Malfoy, and Draco had since been disarmed in turn, wand torn physically from his hand at Malfoy Manor weeks before, by Harry. The Death Stick's loyalty had been following the story all along, and it had ended up, like everything else in this history, in the hand no one had planned. Try for some remorse, Harry said, at the end, and meant it. One orphan of Godric's Hollow to the other, the last unheeded mercy of the war. The sun cleared the windows, both cast at once, the green curse and the plain disarming spell that had become Harry's signature, precisely because the Order once teased him for it, and the Elder Wand, asked by its false master to kill its true one, sent the curse home instead. Tom Riddle died on the floor of the school he had never really left, mortal, ordinary, and the hall's roar shook birds from the forest, and it was over. 36 years, give or take, from the first disappearances to the sunrise, and the Order of the Phoenix had outlasted its enemy twice. If you are still awake, and it is perfectly fine if you are drifting, this is a good moment to rest, because the war itself is told, and the deeper half of the night, the secrets, the portraits, and the ledger of names, still lies ahead. If these long histories help you sleep, the kindest thing you can do for us is to subscribe, and perhaps share the video with someone whose nights are restless. And if you have a thought about the story so far, about Sirius, about Snape, about the choices Dumbledore made, leave it in the comments. I read them, and I would love to know how far into the night you made it. Now, softly, we go back in, the slow way this time. What does the morning after look like for an organization like this one? The great hall filled with the strangest breakfast in its history, no one sitting by house, families and centaurs and teachers and elves crowded along the same tables, the dead lying in state at the top of the room, while the living ate around their grief because bodies demand food even on such mornings. And Kingsley Shacklebolt was named Interim Minister for Magic before the plates were cleared. It is worth pausing on how naturally that happened. Nobody voted. Nobody campaigned. The surviving authority of Wizarding Britain looked around the wreckage for the person everyone trusted, and every eye landed on the same calm, deep-voiced aura who had spent the war guarding the Muggle Prime Minister, running the false hunt for Sirius, and reading the names of murdered Muggles over pirate radio. And the interim appointment simply became permanent over the following months, because no one could think of a reason it shouldn't. The Order of the Phoenix had spent 27 years as an illegal organization, twice branded subversive by the government it was saving. It ended the war by becoming the government. Kingsley's first acts read like the Order's old meeting minutes finally enacted. The Dementors removed from Azkaban forever, the Muggle-born Registration Commission's convictions voided, its victims compensated, the Snatcher gangs hunted down, and Dolores Umbridge, who had presided over the stolen magic trials with a stolen locket at her throat, tried and imprisoned by the same courtroom procedures she had spent a career perverting, with the notable difference that she received an actual trial. The reckonings were not all so clean, and honesty about the Order includes its unfinished business. Fenrir Greyback was taken alive in the battle, brought down by a crowd, and faced justice, which for the maker of Orphaned Werewolves and the mauler of Lavender Brown seemed to many too gentle an outcome. Mundungus Fletcher drifted back out of whatever hole the war's end found him in, unpunished for the flight that killed Mad-Eye Moody, because cowardice, unlike murder, has never been triable, and the Order's own code, the code of a volunteer organization, had no mechanism for a member who simply failed. He had also, the record must add, stripped Grimmauld Place of its valuables during the year it stood empty and sold them, including a certain locket lifted from Creature's hoard, an act of petty theft that had, by pure accident, kept a fragment of Voldemort's soul circulating in the open, where the trio could eventually track it, and there may be no better summary of Mundungus Fletcher than that his one contribution to victory was a burglary. History is not required to be dignified, and there were the funerals. 50 of the defenders died at Hogwarts, and the accounts of the following weeks are a blur of white tombs and country churchyards. But a few images survive with the clarity of the photograph we began with. Fred Weasley was buried with the family estranged no longer. George beside the grave, in a silence no one had ever heard from him. Remus and Nymphadora Lupin were mourned together, and posthumously honoured together, and their orphan son was passed along a row of arms at the service. Weasley to Harry, who held his godson, and understood, in a way perhaps no one else at any funeral that month could, exactly what the child did not yet know he had lost, and exactly how much the people around him could still give. Snape had no funeral to speak of, at first. His rehabilitation moved at the speed of testimony, Harry's testimony, delivered stubbornly and repeatedly to a public that wanted its villains simple, and it culminated years later in a gesture that made the front pages, the naming of a child, Albus Severus Potter, after the two headmasters whose twin secrets had won the war. The wizarding world argued about Snape then, and argues about him still, which feels correct. He was not built to be settled. Take a slow breath here, because the story now runs quiet, and we can let it. The Order of the Phoenix was never formally disbanded, for the pleasing reason that it had never been formally anything. There was no charter to revoke, no roll to close. Some of its habits dissolved into the new ministry, where the Auror office was rebuilt under veterans of the battle, and Harry Potter himself eventually ran it. Others dissolved into Hogwarts, where Minerva McGonagall took the headmistress's chair she had earned across 3 wars, and Neville Longbottom, in time, came home to teach herbology, the professor every student hoped to get, the one with the sword story. Some of its habits simply became family. The photographed survivors and their children, and the children of their dead, kept turning up in each other's kitchens for the rest of their lives. Sunday lunches at the Burrow that needed 3 tables. Teddy Lupin with his hair turquoise at every one of them, raised by his grandmother Andromeda, and fostered in effect by an entire organization, the last ward of the Order of the Phoenix, and by every account the happiest. And now, before we come to the ledger of sacrifices, the full, slow accounting this video promised you, there are secrets still on the table, the ones that never resolved, and a history of the Order that skipped them would be a polite lie. So let us sit with the unanswered questions for a while, the way the survivors did. Begin with Dorcas Meadows, because she may be the deepest mystery the Order ever produced. The facts fit in one sentence. She was a member of the original Order, and Voldemort killed her personally. That is very nearly all that was ever recorded, and the silence around her is louder than most testimony, because consider what the second fact means. Lord Voldemort delegated. It was among his defining traits, a lordly remove, sending masked servants to do the bleeding, while he pursued the projects only he understood. The list of people he is known to have killed with his own wand during the First War is strikingly short, and it consists almost entirely of people who stood between him and something he wanted badly. What did Dorcas Meadows stand between him and? Had she uncovered something, one of the soul vessels perhaps, decades before Dumbledore assembled the theory? Was she close to a name, a location, a pattern? Did she simply hurt him, damage some operation so badly that the punishment had to be personal? The Order's surviving records never say, and the members who might have known died in the same season she did. Somewhere under the story of the First War, there is a Dorcas Meadows-shaped hole, an intelligence coup, or a near miss, or an act of defiance that mattered enough to summon the Dark Lord in person, and it is lost. She is survived by a name on Moody's photograph, and the width of the silence around her. Caradoc Dearborn's mystery is smaller and somehow worse. He vanished. 6 months after the photograph, he was gone, and the Order never found a body, and Moody's summary carries all the weight of the ambiguity. We never found his body, mind you, he could be alive, spoken by a man who plainly believed no such thing, but could not close the sentence. Death in war is grief with a flaw under it. Disappearance has no flaw. For the survivors, Caradoc Dearborn remained technically, corrosively possible for the rest of their lives. A knock that might come, a face that might be in a crowd, and the record suggests it never came, and never was. Whether he died in some unmarked ambush, or was taken and broken somewhere soundproof, or, the bleakest possibility, ran, chose survival, and lived out his years under another name in another country no one has ever established. The Order kept his name on its honor roll. It was the only place left to keep him. Then there is the archway, the stone arch on its dais in the Department of Mysteries, the tattered veil that does not move with any wind, the whispering that some hear and some do not, the thing that took Sirius Black. It is worth knowing that the room containing it is called, by the unspeakables who study such matters, the Death Chamber, and that the veil predates the ministry built around it, and that no one who has passed through it has returned, and that Harry and Luna Lovegood both heard voices from beyond it, faint and familiar, while Hermione, standing beside them, heard nothing at all. The pattern in Who Hears is its own quiet revelation. Harry had seen death. Luna had watched her mother die. The veil speaks, if it speaks, only to those already acquainted with what it guards. The Order never recovered Sirius, because there was nothing to recover, no body, no burial, a man subtracted rather than killed, and Harry spent months afterward interrogating a ghost and a pair of ancient mirrors for a way around the arithmetic, and the answer he finally accepted is the one the whole Order had to accept about all its unrecovered dead. Gone is gone, the living carry the rest. Smaller mysteries stud the record like nails. Who put the tip-off about the Potter's location beyond Pettigrew's betrayal itself? And how much did Voldemort know about the switch of secret keepers before Halloween? Why did the Fidelius charm on the Potters fail so absolutely with the keeper's betrayal, while the charm on Grimmauld Place merely diluted after Dumbledore's death, spreading the secret among all its holders instead of breaking? The unspeakables could tell you, perhaps, and unspeakables are named for what they do not do. What exactly did Arabella Figg see across a decade of watching? Because that is a secret hiding in plain sight. The mad cat lady of Privet Drive, the neighbor who babysat young Harry Potter amid the smell of cabbage and photograph albums of cats, was an Order asset the entire time. A squib, born to magical parents without magic of her own, invisible to wizarding society, and therefore perfect, planted by Dumbledore to keep unblinking watch on the most protected child in Britain, and forbidden to let the boy enjoy a single visit, lest the relatives stop sending him. She deliberately bored a lonely child for a decade as an act of protection, and apologized to him for it exactly once, and the apology is somehow one of the saddest lines in the whole war. And what, finally, became of the 200,000 galleon bounty, the blood money posted on undesirable number 1? It was never paid. Somewhere in the ruined regime's books there is an unclaimed reward for Harry Potter, dead or alive, and the wizarding world let it lapse, which is its own small verdict on how completely the story turned. There are also the members this history has so far kept at the edges, and a complete account owes them the center of the frame for a while, because the Order's fame pooled around a handful of names, and its work never did. Minerva McGonagall's war is easy to miss, precisely because she never left her post. She joined no photograph of the original Order, though she worked with it from the start, because her assignment was the one that never changed: hold Hogwarts. Across both wars she was the constant, the Transfiguration mistress with the tight bun and the tartan dressing gown, who taught the children of members she had fought beside, and then taught their orphans. Her style was a kind of camouflage. The regime of the Second War never quite understood what she was, filing her as a stern old teacher to be managed, and she let them believe it, and taught under the Carrows for a year, absorbing what punishment she could deflect onto herself, and coordinating, quietly, with the other heads of house, so that when the last night came, the castle's resistance did not have to be organized. It already existed. She had been running it under the enemy's nose the entire year, disguised as a school. In the end she dueled Snape, dueled Voldemort himself before sunrise, took 3 stunning spells to the chest at once during the previous year's troubles, and came back from St. Mungo's with a walking stick, an undimmed contempt, and her single most quoted moment of the entire war remains her answer to the Carrow's colleague when he spat at the students' defense of the castle. She had always wanted to use that spell, she said, bringing the suits of armor thundering down from their plinths, and generations of listeners have loved that line for its joy, and the joy is the point. 36 years of war, and the Order's Iron Lady met the last night of it with delight. Rubeus Hagrid's assignments read, in retrospect, like a measure of exactly how much Dumbledore trusted him, which was totally, and how the wizarding world in general regarded him, which was not at all. He was the very first Order face Harry Potter ever saw. the giant silhouette on the doorstep of a shack in the sea carrying a squashed birthday cake, sent to retrieve the boy, because Dumbledore knew the Dursleys would not dare argue with him, and, one suspects, because Dumbledore wanted the boy's first impression of the magical world to be kindness in an enormous coat. It was Hagrid at the very beginning, motorbike over the ruined house at Godric's Hollow, and Hagrid at the very end, carrying what he believed was the body through the forest, weeping, and between those bookends he undertook the mission with the lowest survival odds the Order ever issued, the embassy to the Giants. In the first summer of the Second War, he and Olympe Maxime, the headmistress of the French school, and like him half-giant, walked into the mountains of the east to reach the last giant colonies before Voldemort's envoys could close the deal, months overland, because giants notice apparition, bearing gifts of goblin-made treasure by protocol, and they arrived to find the enemy's men already seated at the fire. The mission failed, mostly. The colony's politics turned. A friendly chieftain's head was, in Hagrid's flat telling, no longer attached to the body by the next visit, and Death Eater Gold won the argument. But Hagrid came home with something no one had assigned, his half-brother Grawp, a 16-foot runt bullied by the colony, dragged across a continent by a man constitutionally incapable of leaving family behind, and on the last night, when giants breached the walls of Hogwarts, one small giant fought for the school. Even Hagrid's failures compounded interest. Kingsley Shacklebolt's finest work of the war was the assignment nobody could ever thank him for, because its success was measured in nothing happening. After the fall of the Ministry, no, even before it, the Order had grasped a danger the wizarding government barely bothered with, that Voldemort's contempt for Muggles made their Prime Minister both a target and a tool. So Kingsley was placed inside Downing Street itself, presented to the Muggle world as a superbly efficient civil servant, and for the darkest year of the occupation, the most senior Auror the Order had guarded a man who never learned his bodyguard could turn him into a teapot. He did the work between his broadcasts as Royal on Potterwatch, which means the future Minister for Magic spent the war commuting between the Muggle government by day and an illegal radio shack by night, and it says everything about the Order's chronic manpower that this arrangement struck no one as unusual. Bill Weasley carried the war on his face for the rest of his life. The eldest Weasley son, cursebreaker for Gringotts Bank, long-haired and cool enough that even his mother's disapproval bounced off, was savaged by Fenrir Greyback on the night of the astronomy tower, and because Greyback was untransformed, the moon elsewhere in its month, the wounds fell short of the full curse. Bill did not become a werewolf. He became something the wizarding world had no tidy category for. Scarred, marked, fond of his steak alarmingly rare, and it was an open question in the hospital wing that first night, asked aloud by his own mother through tears, whether the wedding could go forward now, whether Fleur Delacour, part Vila, radiantly beautiful, engaged to the handsomest of the Weasleys, would still want what Greyback had left. Fleur's answer entered the family's permanent legend. She took the ointment from Molly's hands and dressed the wounds herself, informing the room that she was good-looking enough for both of them, and the two women who had spent a year politely at war over the wedding wept on each other, and the marriage that began under a Patronus warning at the reception went on to shelter half the fugitives of the occupation at Shell Cottage, including a dying elf, a broken goblin, and the trio at the lowest hour of their hunt. There is a small grave in the garden of that cottage, dug by hand without magic, and Fleur kept flowers on it. Hestia Jones and Daedalus Diggle drew the Order's oddest posting, and it belongs in the record because it completes a circle. Someone had to move the Dursleys. Harry's coming of age would end the blood protection over Privet Drive, and the enemy would arrive at that house within hours looking for hostages. So in the last week of July too, Order members knocked on the most magic-proof door in Britain to escort Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley Dursley into hiding. And everything about the assignment was thankless. Vernon renegotiating his cooperation on the doorstep, the family's luggage full of televisions, Daedalus's top hat, and relentless cheer landing on the Dursleys like weather. And in the middle of the departure, the war produced one of its least likely graces. Dudley Dursley, the cousin who had spent a childhood using Harry as furniture, and whose soul had once been shown to him by a Dementor in an alley, stopped in the doorway and asked why Harry wasn't coming, and shook his hand, and said he didn't think Harry was a waste of space. It is a low bar, as farewells go. Harry ranked it, sincerely, alongside a declaration of love, because he was grading on the curve of that house. The order kept the Dursleys safe for the entire year of the occupation. 3 people who had never said thank you to a wizard in their lives, and that, as much as any battle, is what the organization was. Protection was not a reward for being lovable, it was the job. We should speak, too, about the Order's tools and tradecraft as a body of secrets in themselves, because the organization's survival across 2 wars against a stronger enemy was not luck, and the methods deserve their own quiet chapter, the kind you can let wash over you as the night deepens. The Patronus messenger system remained the Order's signature to the end, and its elegance grows the longer you look at it. A message needed to travel fast, arrive only where intended, resist interception, and authenticate its sender beyond forgery, and the Patronus did all 4 with a single charm, because the silver animal moves at the speed of thought, ignores walls and wards, speaks in its caster's own voice, and wears a shape that rises from the caster's soul and cannot be imitated. Kingsley's Lynx at the Wedding is the system's masterpiece, a warning outrunning an attack by seconds across a hostile country. But the system had a vulnerability the Order rarely spoke of, and it is a strangely intimate one. A Patronus can change. It is keyed to the deepest attachments of its caster, and when those attachments shift, the animal shifts with them, and so the Order's communication network doubled, awkwardly, as a live display of its members' hearts. Tonks's Patronus transformed during the war into a wolf, and everyone who saw it knew at once what, and who, it meant, and Snape is said to have sneered at the weakness of it. Snape, whose own Patronus had been the copy of a dead woman's for 17 years. The Order's encryption ran on love, and love, as the whole history shows, was simultaneously the strongest and the most exposed thing any of them carried. The Fidelius charm was the heavier armor, and the Order's use of it across both wars amounts to a running seminar in its dangers. The charm is close to absolute, a secret buried in a living soul, and the Order learned by catastrophe that the absoluteness is exactly the problem, because it concentrates all risk into a single human being, and human beings are the one component that cannot be warded. The Potters died of a compromised keeper. Grimmauld Place survived Dumbledore's death but leaked into uncertainty afterward, its secret multiplying among every holder, until a Death Eater physically forced his way in on the heels of the fleeing trio, and the house was written off. By the last year, the Order ran Fidelius, the way you run any system after hard lessons, in depth and in parallel, Shell Cottage under one charm, with Bill as keeper, Aunt Muriel's under another, the Tonks home, safe houses chained so that the fall of any one node stranded no one, and the keepers, chosen not for prominence, but for the opposite. The first war's fatal cleverness, the decoy keeper, the switch nobody knew, was never tried again. The Order had learned that in secrecy, complexity is not sophistication, complexity is surface area. And there were the humbler instruments, and the night is a good time to inventory them slowly. The enchanted galleons of Dumbledore's army, Hermione's schoolgirl adaptation of the enemy's own dark mark, coins that warmed in the pocket and carried the time of the next gathering, which in the final year became the mobilization system for the Battle of Hogwarts, a resistance summoned by pocket change. The two-way mirrors, James Potter and Sirius Black's old detention toys, one of which, shattered, passed a cry for help out of a cellar in Malfoy Manor to Aberforth's blue eye at the bottom of a shard, so that the Marauders' juvenile contraband ended up saving the war's most important prisoners a decade after both owners were dead. Moody's faux glass and secrecy sensors, his dustbin lids and his hip flask paranoia, which the survivors teased him for, and then, after his fall, quietly adopted almost item for item. The Weasley clock with 9 hands and no numbers, every hand pointing at mortal peril for a solid year, which Molly took to carrying with her from room to room like a rosary. The Order fought the richest dark wizard network in history, with classroom charms, family heirlooms, and second-hand junk, and the junk held, because every piece of it was made or kept by someone who loved the person it protected, and if this long history has a single engineering principle running through it, that is the one. Set against all this, it is fair to ask, and listeners drifting at the edge of sleep have earned an honest answer, whether the Order's legendary secrecy was worth its costs, because the costs were real, and this account has not hidden them. Dumbledore's rationing of truth ran the plan through a needle's eye twice, once when occlumency failed for lack of trust and Sirius died of the resulting vision, Once, when the final secret of Harry's scar came within one memory vial of dying undelivered on a boathouse floor, members were suspected wrongly, Sirius by Remus and Remus by Sirius, for want of information their own leadership possessed. A man spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime his comrades could have disproven if the compartments had been one wall thinner. The case for the defense is simply the First War's arithmetic, an organization of a few dozen against an enemy of thousands, riddled once by a single traitor and nearly annihilated, and the verdict of the survivors, for whatever it is worth, was Moody's grunted maxim made policy: tell each what each must know, and grieve the price. The Order was not a family, though it kept becoming one against its own doctrine. It was a lantern carried through a gale, hand to hand, and hands were lost, and the flame crossed 36 years without going out, and whether that justifies everything is a question this channel will leave burning quietly beside you tonight, rather than answer. Let the story breathe backward for a while now, because there is a whole texture of the First War that the rush of events earlier tonight could only sketch, and the deep of the night is the right place for it. The slow, granular feel of what it was to be alive and hunted in the Britain of the late 1970s. The terror of those years had a domestic quality that later generations struggle to picture. It lived in routines. Families checked the sky over their homes before landing brooms, because the dark mark, the glittering green skull cast over a house, meant the enemy had been inside, and every witch and wizard of that generation carried the same specific dread, described by those who survived it as the worst fear of the age, of coming home to that constellation over your own roof, of knowing what waited downstairs before you opened the door. People stopped gathering, weddings shrank to witnesses. The Death Eater's masks did something worse than hide faces. They multiplied suspicion outward into everyone, because if the enemy could be anyone, then everyone was a little bit the enemy, and old friends met in public with wands loose and passphrases agreed in advance. The same barbed private questions the Order later formalized. What did you say to me the night we first met? What shape does my Patronus take? And hesitation on the answer could end the friendship, or the meeting, or, more than once, the hesitator. Moody drilled the Order in those verifications until members could run them half asleep, and the drills bred their own black comedy. It is recorded that Order members challenged each other across their own kitchen tables, that James Potter once demanded the passphrase of his own reflection after a long shift, and the laughter such stories carried was load-bearing. It was how they stayed people. The ministry of those years, it must be said plainly, fought hard and fought dirty, and the Order's relationship to that hardness was queasier than legend remembers. As the war worsened, Barty Crouch Sr. rose through magical law enforcement on a platform of ruthlessness, and his measures tell you how close the government came to the cliff edge. Auras authorized to use the unforgivable curses, to kill rather than capture, suspects shipped to the Dementors without trial, and a public so frightened it applauded. Crouch was harder on the dark side than many of the dark side themselves, and for a season, he was the most popular man in Britain and presumptive next minister. The Order fought the same enemy and refused most of the same methods, and the refusal was policy, Moody's policy above all. The great Aura bringing his prisoners in breathing, while colleagues stopped bothering, and it cost them, in speed, in intelligence, in members. It also preserved something. When Crouch's methods finally devoured his own house, his son unmasked as a Death Eater, sentenced by his own father to Azkaban in a show trial, while his mother screamed, the whole hard line collapsed into scandal, and the difference between the Ministry's war and the Order's war became suddenly legible to everyone. Both sides of the light had fought the darkness. Only one of them would have been recognizable to itself afterward, and through it all, the Order's youngest members were living compressed lives, and the compression is worth feeling. James and Lily Potter fought Voldemort face to face 3 times, the 3 defiances of the prophecy, before either of them turned 21. They married in wartime, a small ceremony with Sirius as best man, went underground before their son could walk, and the last year of their lives shrank to the inside of a cottage, James pacing the garden of a house he could not leave, doing conjuring tricks with muggle sweets to make the baby laugh, the invisibility cloak, their one great asset, borrowed away by Dumbledore for study, at exactly the wrong moment. Lily's letters from that year survive in fragments, thank you notes for a child's first birthday broomstick, gossip about neighbors, Grief for the McKinnons folded between paragraphs. The handwriting of a 21-year-old woman keeping a household cheerful inside a death sentence. Sirius, 22, was living alone on his dead uncle's money, with the whole order half suspecting him and his best friends, locked behind a secret he had arranged to be excluded from, by his own cleverness, for their safety. When people ask why the First Order holds such a grip on the imagination, the answer is partly this, that its story is a story about the very young. The average age of the names on the memorial lists of the First War is a number that embarrasses every peaceful generation that reads it. There is one more thread of the First War owed its full length here, and it is the strangest one, the war inside the House of Black, because the Order's future headquarters was, in those same years, an enemy household, and its two sons ran the war's whole moral spectrum between them. Number 12, Grimmauld Place in the 1970s, believed in Voldemort's cause, the way old money believes in anything, from a safe distance, approvingly, checkbook first. Wahlberger Black's portrait screamed in the 90s what the living woman preached in the 70s, and her elder son fled it at 16, taken in by the Potters, blasted off the family tree on the wall, while her younger son absorbed it. Regulus, the good one, the Quidditch player with the newspaper clippings about the Dark Lord, pinned to his bedroom wall like a fan, taking the mark, at an age when he could not legally buy his own fire whiskey. The brothers did not speak again. Sirius went to his grave believing Regulus a coward, who fled the Death Eaters, and was killed for it. A story he told with a shrug, in front of that very wall hanging, feet from the very elf, that could have corrected him. And the correction, when Creature finally spoke it years too late, redrew the family entirely. Both sons of the house had died defying Voldemort, one loudly, in battle, laughing, and one silently, in a cave, with no witness but a servant sworn to secrecy. The Order of the Phoenix had spent years headquartered inside the evidence of its own blind spot. The locket had been in the house the whole time, surviving the great clean-out of Grimmauld Place in a hoard under an elf's blanket. Handled and discarded by half the membership, the fragment of Voldemort's soul passed around a room full of his enemies like a curio nobody could open. If the Order's history teaches one discipline above all others, it is this one, and the old members taught it to the young ones with rueful smiles for the rest of their lives. Look again at whatever you have decided is beneath your notice. The war kept its secrets there. There remains one private war to account for before the ledger, the one Dumbledore fought alone inside the larger one, because the Order's official history and its leader's secret history ran side by side for years, touching only where he allowed, and the full shape of what he was doing emerged only after everyone who could have objected was past objecting. While the Order guarded corridors and ran safe houses, Dumbledore was hunting the soul of Tom Riddle through the past. The work had begun decades earlier, in a sense, on the day a Hogwarts deputy head visited a Muggle orphanage and met a boy who already used magic to hurt and to collect trophies of the hurting, and it sharpened into method after the First War, memory by memory, interview by interview. He tracked down the retired witch who had witnessed Riddle's mother's last days, and the barman who remembered the gaunts. He courted Horace Slughorn for years, decades, to obtain the one memory that mattered most, the true version of a conversation in which a 16-year-old Riddle, prefect's badge gleaming, had asked his favorite teacher a question about the darkest magic there is, whether a soul could be split not once but many times, whether 7, the most powerfully magical number, might not be better than 1. Slughorn had answered, flattered and unwary, and spent the rest of his life editing the memory in shame, and the uncut version, when Harry finally charmed it out of him, confirmed the scale of the theory. Not one anchor. 6. By design. With the 7th fragment in the body, a soul deliberately shattered like a hoarder, distributing valuables among vaults. The Order fought a man. Dumbledore, nearly alone, fought an inventory. He told the Order none of it. Weigh that for a moment against everything this history has shown about the costs of his secrecy, because here the ledger runs the other way. Had the enemy ever suspected that anyone had counted his anchors, he could have moved them, multiplied them, sunk them beyond finding, and the war would have become unwinnable in an afternoon. So the knowledge lived in one head, then in one head and a memory basin, then, in the final year, in 3 teenagers in a tent, and at every stage the entire outcome of the war, balanced on fewer lives than a Quidditch team. The ring destroyed his hand because even he, the theory's author, could be ambushed through grief. The cave nearly finished him early, and the account of that night, the potion he drank by his own prior order, while begging his 16-year-old companion to stop, make it stop, it's all my fault, hurt them instead. The words boiling up from whatever the potion showed him. Ariana, one has to assume, always Ariana, is as close as the record ever comes to the inside of Albus Dumbledore, and the Order never heard a word of it while he lived. And there was a second secret war under the first, older and stranger, and the occupation year dragged it into the light, the Deathly Hallows. The children's story of the three brothers, and Death's gifts, the unbeatable wand, the stone that recalls the dead, the cloak that hides from Death himself, was, Dumbledore had concluded across a lifetime, a garbled record of three real objects, and his youthful obsession with them had been the very engine of the catastrophe with Grindelwald, two brilliant boys planning to collect the set. The war's finale turned out to be built from all three. The cloak had been in the Potter family for centuries, handed down from the third brother, which meant the Order's most protected child was the story's literal heir. The stone was set in the ring that killed Dumbledore's hand, and he hid it where his own plan would deliver it, inside the golden snitch, releasing at the close, so that a boy walking to his death could have what Dumbledore himself had wanted too much to be trusted with. And the wand was the reason he had planned his death like a chess retirement, an unbeaten master arranging to die undefeated, so that the Death Stick's trail of murders would simply end in a tomb, a plan Voldemort broke into, and Draco's disarming spell rewrote, and the whole tangled inheritance sorted itself, in the last hour, into the hands of the one person in the story, with the strange distinction of not wanting any of it. Harry used the stone once, dropped it where it fell in the forest, and never searched. He repaired his own broken wand with the Elder Wand's power and put the unbeatable thing back in the tomb, and wizarding history's longest, bloodiest treasure hunt ended with the winner declining the prize. Dumbledore, the portrait, wept and laughed at once. He had gambled the entire design on the boy's heart being shaped exactly like that, and it was the one bet in 2 wars he never hedged. And now the ledger. Every history of the Order of the Phoenix owes its dead a slow reading, and this one will take its time, name by name, because you are lying in the dark with hours of night ahead of you, and there is no better use for a stretch of it than remembering people who were brave. Let the names come at a walking pace. If you drift somewhere in the middle of them, that is all right. They will keep. From the First War, Marlene McKinnon, who smiled out of the photograph and was dead within 2 weeks of it, killed with her entire family, mourned in a young mother's letters. Benji Fenwick, of whom the record preserves 1 sentence, and the sentence is terrible, and who deserves the 2nd sentence this reading now gives him, that he stood with the Order when standing was likeliest to be fatal, and it was. Dorcas Meadows, who mattered enough to die by the Dark Lord's own hand, her secret intact, her silence outlasting her enemy. Caradoc Dearborn, who vanished, and for whom hope was never formally ended, which is its own long sentence served by everyone who loved him. Edgar Bones, great wizard by the estimate of the hardest judge in the Aura office, killed with his wife and his children, the family paying together, as the enemy intended, and failing to stay erased, because his sister rose to head magical law enforcement, and his niece fought at Hogwarts, and the Bones name walked out of both wars still upright. Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, the brothers who cost 5 Death Eaters a fight none of the 5 ever bragged about, whose watch ticked on a nephew's wrist at the end of everything, whose sister avenged them without once saying their names, though the whole hall heard them anyway. Frank and Alice Longbottom, not dead, and counted here regardless, because what was taken from them was taken absolutely. 2 of the finest auras of the age, reduced to a closed ward and empty sweet wrappers, and their sacrifice compounded daily for decades, and their son grew into the answer to it. And James and Lily Potter, 21 years old, 3 times defiant, whose last minutes bought each other seconds, and their son a lifetime, whose deaths founded the entire second half of this story, and whose gravestone in the churchyard at Godric's Hollow carries a line that confused their son when he first read it, and comforts everyone who has read it since. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. From the years between the wars, one name, spoken with the ambivalence he earned, Regulus Arcturus Black, Death Eater, 18, who saw what his master was before the great and the good ever did, and undid a piece of it alone, in the dark, in agony, having ordered the only witness home. The order never recruited him, and never knew him, and he is on its roll now because the roll is honest, and courage counted the same from every direction. From the Second War, Sirius Black, 12 years wrongly imprisoned, 2 years half-free, who died laughing in combat beside his godson, in the 1 hour of those 14 years that felt like his old life, and left a motorbike, a house, a name cleared too late, and a hole in Harry Potter that never fully closed. Emmeline Vance, stately in the photograph, murdered within sight of the Muggle government she helped protect. Amelia Bones, the third of her family in this reading. Rufus Scrimger, no friend of the Order, counted by the Order regardless, tortured for a location and giving nothing, a hard man spending his last coin on a boy he disliked. Alastor Moody, whose whole biography was the price of vigilance, fallen from the July sky guarding the weakest link by choice, buried in the only sense available under a tree, one eye recovered, the rest of him keeping whatever counsel the dead keep. Ted Tonks, who married across the bloodline, laughed about it, ran rather than register, and died fighting in a winter field so that strangers running with him might not. Dirk Cresswell and the others of the fugitive roads, names the wireless read out weekly, each one somebody's whole world. Dobby, a free elf, who took a knife thrown by Bellatrix Lestrange while rescuing prisoners from a cellar he had no duty to enter, buried without magic by the boy he saved, under a headstone whose 4 words, "Here lies Dobby, a free elf," say more about what the war was over than most treaties manage. Peter Pettigrew, entered here not in honor but in accuracy, strangled by his own silver hand in the instant a flicker of mercy toward the boy whose parents he sold cost him his master's collateral, the debt Dumbledore always predicted coming due in the cruelest available currency. Severus Snape, headmaster of Hogwarts, double agent for 17 years, the bravest man Harry Potter said he ever knew, and the argument that sentence started has no end, which is fitting, and his portrait hangs in the office now, which is more than fitting, it is the verdict. Fred Weasley, mid-laugh. Remus John Lupin, who was given, in his last year, everything he had decided men like him were not allowed, and defended it. Nymphadora Tonks, who would want it noted one final time that she preferred her surname, and who followed her husband into the last battle 5 weeks after their son was born, because the Order never once asked whether a sacrifice was fair. Colin Creevey, 16, who came back in. Lavender Brown, the 50 of Hogwarts, and the unnumbered of both wars, the Muggles of the bridge and the villages, the families under the dark marks, the names Potterwatch read aloud, and the names nobody caught. That is the ledger, or as much of it as one night can hold. Notice, before we leave it, what the names have in common, because it is not what their enemy had in common. The Death Eaters were a single shape repeated, pure blood, or aspiring to it, drawn by power, held by fear. The Order's dead were a werewolf, a squib's employers, 2 elves, an escaped heir, a barman's customers, aurors and burglars, teenagers and pensioners, a ministry lion, and a muggle born on the run. And the only property the whole roll shares is the choice, freely made, most of them more than once, to stand between the fire and someone else. Dumbledore said it in a dozen ways, across 2 wars, and the plainest version is the one to fall asleep on. It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. The survivors' afterlives are the part of this history most often skipped, and skipping them gets the story wrong, because the measure of the Order was never only who it lost. It was also what the ones it saved did with the saving, and the record of the following decades is, by the standards of everything you have heard tonight, almost unbearably gentle. Kingsley Shacklebolt's ministry reformed the wizarding state with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had seen exactly where every rotten beam ran. He staffed the rebuilt Auror office with veterans of the battle, waiving the usual qualifications for those whose qualifications had been earned in corridors under curse fire, and Harry Potter joined at 17 and led the department by 27, and Ron Weasley served beside him for 2 years before doing something that made both wars dead laugh somewhere, leaving law enforcement to run a joke shop. Weasley's wizard wheezes had been Fred and George's answer to the darkness, even while it gathered, the shop on Diagon Alley blazing with colour in a street of boarded windows, shield hats sold to the ministry by the gross, you-know-poo, advertised in the window under the enemy's name, while other shops would not print it, and after Fred, everyone quietly assumed the shop would close. George kept it open. It nearly broke him, and then it remade him. And in time he married Angelina Johnson, who had known Fred as well as anyone, and their first son was named Fred. And if you want a single image of how the survivors carried the dead, that shop, loud, ridiculous, thriving, staffed by a one-eared man selling laughter for a living, is the image this channel would choose. Hermione Granger went into the ministry and did what everyone who had ever shared a classroom with her knew she would: rewrote it, first in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, where the laws that had ground down Remus Lupin and Dobby's whole species began to fall, statute by statute, then in magical law enforcement, and eventually, in the fullness of years, as Minister for Magic herself, the Muggle-born the regime had tried, sitting where the regime had sat. Luna Lovegood became a naturalist, wandering the world after strange creatures with the same serene certainty she had brought to the Department of Mysteries at 14, and married the grandson of the man who wrote the textbook on magical beasts, and the girl whose bedroom ceiling in the occupation year was found painted with the faces of her 5 friends ringed by the golden word friends over and over, remained precisely what she had always been, the Order's proof that gentleness and courage were never different things. Neville Longbottom taught. Of everything in the aftermath, his afterlife may be the most quietly perfect. The boy the war had bent into a commander unbending, on purpose, back into a kind man in a greenhouse, Professor Longbottom of herbology, and the students who trooped through his classes for decades mostly had no idea, until someone told them, that the round-faced teacher repotting shrivel figs had drawn the sword of Gryffindor out of a burning hat in front of the Dark Lord and all his army, and killed the last piece of Voldemort's soul in the same minute, and visited, all his life, a closed ward where he was not recognized, with sweets. Harry married Ginny Weasley, which surprised no one, and grieved everyone he had lost, slowly, over years, which surprised him. They had 3 children, and the naming of them reads like a settling of accounts: James Sirius, Albus Severus, Lily Luna, 4 dead and 1 living friend, distributed among 3 children, the family tree the war had cut down regrafted deliberately onto the future. Teddy Lupin grew up exactly as promised, hair turquoise, adored, at the Potter's table so often the younger children assumed for years he lived there, head boy at the school where his father had taught and his mother had crashed into umbrella stands, and the epilogue of the whole vast story, the image its own tellers chose to end on, is small on purpose. Platform 9 3/4, 19 years after the battle, steam and trunks and owls, the survivors middle-aged and calling children back from windows, and a boy named Albus Severus, afraid of being sorted into Slytherin, and his father crouching to tell him that one of the bravest men he ever knew came from there, and that the choice, as always, would be his. The scar had not hurt in 19 years. All was well. The Order of the Phoenix does not appear in that scene, and that is the point of the scene. Its victory condition had always been its own irrelevance, a world in which the photograph could stay in a drawer. Hogwarts remembers them in stone, and in stranger ways. There is a memorial on the grounds where the 50 are named, and every 2nd of May the school falls quiet at the hour the shield broke. Snape's portrait hangs in the headmaster's office, added on Harry's insistence, beside Dumbledore's, the 2 of them presumably continuing the war's longest argument in oil paint. The Room of Requirement, damaged by cursed fire in the battle, healed itself in time, as the castle always does, and generations of students have since found the room and used it and never known that it once slept 80. The hogshead passed eventually out of Aberforth's hands, though he lived to a formidable age, brusque to the end, and the portrait of a young girl above the mantel went wherever he went, and visitors who asked about her got a grunt, and the ones who somehow already knew got, occasionally, a drink on the house. Grimmauld Place stands. Harry inherited it twice over, from Sirius directly, and from the war generally, and the reports differ on what became of it, but the woven family tree survives, burn marks and all, and somewhere on it, if the family's own rules had ever been honestly applied, the 2 blasted sons would be restored in gold, Sirius and Regulus, the loud one and the silent one, the House of Black redeemed entirely by its runaways. And Creature, it pleases this channel to report, served the House of Potter with terrifying devotion, cooked, by every account, a superb steak and kidney pie, and was last recorded, at an age no one could compute, still polishing Regulus's locket every day. Master of a story he was finally, at long last, allowed to tell. Before the night closes over this history, spend a while longer in the quiet, with the question underneath all of it, the one the whole 36 years keeps asking from different angles. Why did the Order of the Phoenix work? Because on paper, it never should have. Set the two organizations side by side one last time, slowly, the way you might turn a familiar object over in your hands in the dark, and the comparison is stranger than any single battle. The Death Eaters had everything an insurgency is supposed to need: wealth, old names, placement in every department of government, a monopoly on ruthlessness, a leader of genuinely historic ability, and a recruiting pitch, purity and power, engineered for the oldest appetites there are. The Order had a schoolteacher's savings, a condemned townhouse, a stolen year here and there of somebody's evenings, and a recruiting pitch that promised, in Moody's honest formulation, danger, secrecy, and a decent chance of dying horribly for people who would never know your name. And the Order won twice. Any account of why has to begin with the observation that the two groups were held together by opposite forces, and the difference told over time in ways neither side fully saw. Fear scales quickly and decays quickly. The Death Eaters at their height were legion, and the first moment their master fell, they became a scattering of men in expensive robes, swearing to courtrooms that they had been cursed the whole time, because an organization bonded by terror has exactly one load-bearing wall. Loyalty scales slowly and decays almost not at all. The Order at its lowest was a radio signal and a room full of hammocks, and it regrew from that, twice, from less than that, because every member had been recruited through a relationship rather than a threat, and relationships, as this whole history has demonstrated at intolerable cost, keep working after death. Lily's protection outlived her by 17 years and won the war twice on its own. Regulus's order to Creature outlived him by the same span and delivered the locket. Dumbledore ran the entire final campaign from a portrait and a memory basin. Sirius's mirror, James's cloak, Fabian's watch, the dead of this story, are the most active dead in the history of warfare, and it is because of what bound them while they lived. Voldemort, who feared death above all things and mutilated his soul to escape it, built an organization that could not survive him. The people who accepted death built one that could not be killed. There is a symmetry there, so exact, it feels authored, and perhaps, in the sense that choices author everything in this story, it was. It is also true, and the deep of the night is the time for such admissions, that the Order was lucky, repeatedly, outrageously, and that its own virtues manufactured much of the luck. Creature's redemption was luck, purchased by Regulus's decency and unlocked by Harry's, years apart. The Elder One's whole trajectory was luck, of the kind that only landed the right way, because the boy at the end of it had been raised, by example after example, Lupin's patience, Molly's fierceness, Sirius's loyalty, Dumbledore's regrets confessed almost too late, to want the right things. The Order's great fortune was not that fortune favored it. It was that the organization kept producing people onto whom fortune could safely fall. Even its failures compounded strangely into assets. The ignored elf who became the Kitchen Legion's general, the hated double agent whose hatred was his camouflage, the estranged brother whose bitterness kept a back door unwatched, the expelled gamekeeper trusted with every beginning and every end. If you are looking for the Order's actual secret, after 3 hours of its secrets, it may simply be this. It was an organization that wasted nothing and no one, not even its own mistakes, not even its enemy's cruelty, and against an adversary who wasted everything, who spent followers and soul alike, as if supply were infinite. The thrift of love turned out to be the decisive economy of the war. One more turn of the object in the dark, the last one. Recall the two questions that faced each other across the whole story, like the brothers of Grimmauld Place. Voldemort asked, from the orphanage to the great hall floor, how do I matter forever? And every anchor he made, every name he took, every mark he burned into arms and skies, was that question restated, and the answer the universe finally gave him was a body on the floor, ordinary-sized, that the accounts all note, seemed smaller than anyone remembered. The Order asked, in its meetings and kitchens, a question that sounds humbler and is not, who watches tonight? Just that, rotations, guard shifts, whose turn, who relieves whom at dawn. And the answer to that question turned out to be self-renewing in a way no soul anchor ever managed, because every person the watch protected became, in time, someone who took a watch. Harry guarded from a cat watcher's window to guarding a department, the DA children to professors and ministers and mothers of the next roster, and the watch has no reason ever to end, which is the only kind of forever actually on offer, and the Order found it by accident, by simply doing the next night's shift for 36 years. Tom Riddle spent a lifetime seeking immortality and produced a cautionary tale. A few dozen tired people passing a lantern hand to hand produced the thing he was looking for. It was never hidden. It was just heavy and had to be carried and could only be carried together. And that, in the end, past every secret this night has opened, is the whole engineering of the Order of the Phoenix. And the reason a phoenix was always the correct bird. Since the hour is late, and the great movements of the story are done, let the last stretch of this history be small on purpose. Wars are remembered in speeches and battles, and lived in objects and rooms, and the Order of the Phoenix left behind a museum's worth of humble things that no museum ever collected. Walk through them slowly with me, one at a time, the way you might drift through rooms of a house at night, touching nothing, remembering everything. There is the photograph itself, where we began, curling at the edges by the time Moody showed it to Harry, the original Order crowded into the frame and waving, some of them, at a future that had already happened to them by the time the boy looked. Photographs in the wizarding world move, remember. The dead in them go on waving. Marlene McKinnon is still smiling in it somewhere, 2 weeks out from the end, forever, and there is something in that which is either unbearable or comforting depending on the hour of the night, and this channel has never decided which. There is Fabian Pruitt's watch, dented, gold, older than its second owner, given to Harry on his 17th birthday, because wizarding custom gives a man a watch at 17, and Molly had one put away. It kept time through everything that followed, the tent, the winter, the battle, and the account books of the war would file it as nothing at all, one second-hand timepiece, and the human ledger files it differently, a murdered brother's belonging, strapped to the wrist of the boy who ended the murderers, ticking. There is the flying motorbike, bought by a teenager to annoy his mother, lent to a half-giant on the worst night of the First War, enchanted by an enthusiast father in a shed between ministry shifts, and crashed, finally, gloriously, into a garden pond with the Second War's most wanted passenger alive in the sidecar. Arthur Weasley rebuilt it afterward, of course he did, part by part, in the same shed. Some things survive because they are protected. Some survive because they are loved by people who cannot stop fixing them, and the Order ran, disproportionately, on the second kind. There is the two-way mirror shard, and this object the night should hold longest. James and Sirius used the pair to talk between separate detentions, two boys inventing, for the purpose of mischief, a private channel no teacher could tap. Sirius gave one to Harry too late, and Harry, grieving, nearly threw it away, and a fragment of it rode in a rucksack for a year like a splinter of the dead, and then, from the bottom of a cellar in the worst house in Britain, it carried one blue eye's worth of hope in, and one cry for help out, and the rescue it summoned cost a free elf his life, and saved the 3 lives the whole war turned on. Every object in this museum argues the same case, that in the Order's economy nothing loving was ever wasted, but the mirror argues it best, a toy that outlived both its owners to finish their work. There are the sweet wrappers. We will not linger. Neville kept every one, and the museum keeps them too, and walks on quietly. There is the Weasley clock, 9 golden hands, no numbers, locations instead. Home, school, work, travelling, lost, hospital, prison, and the one at the bottom, mortal peril, where all 9 hands stood pointed for the last year of the war, the house's heartbeat rendered visible on a kitchen wall. Molly carried it with her, room to room, laundry basket to laundry basket, a woman holding her whole family in her arms, in the only form the war would let her, and on the 2nd of May 1998, at some hour no one thought to record, 8 of the 9 hands moved at last to home, and 1 did not, and the clock, which cannot lie, has 1 hand that never moved again, and the family kept it anyway, kept it because of that, and if you have ever kept a broken thing for the sake of where it stopped, you already understand the Order of the Phoenix, at a depth no history can add to. There is the locket, both lockets. The true one, Slytherin's, heavy and cold. with its serpent S in glittering green stones, worn in turns around 3 young necks in a tent because it could not be left unguarded, souring the mind of whoever carried it, the closest the hunt ever came to breaking, and destroyed at last in a frozen forest by a sword in the hands of the friend it had driven away, and who came back. And the false one, tin by comparison, worthless by any appraisal, holding only a folded note signed with 3 initials, R.A.B., the single most valuable document of the war, 18 words of defiance, addressed to the Dark Lord, in the certainty he would read them over a corpse. He never read them at all. Creature polished the false locket daily, and polish is prayer in the language of elves, and between the 2 lockets, the priceless one that carried poison, and the worthless one that carried courage, the war's whole theory of value is stated more clearly than this narrator could ever manage. There is a bottled memory, silver, and slow-moving, the last thing a dying man ever gave anyone, still, one assumes, in the keeping of the family whose second son bears his name. There is a snitch with flesh memory, opening at the close, empty now, its cargo dropped somewhere on the forest floor and never sought, so that somewhere under the leaf mould of that forest, to this day, lies the resurrection stone, the second hallow, treasure of treasures, resting exactly where the only person wise enough to own it decided it belonged, which is lost. There is a headstone by the sea carved by hand, without magic, the letters uneven because grief was doing the carving. Here lies Dobby, a free elf, and there is, at the end of the inventory, a lantern, not a real one. The one this history has carried through its own dark, the figure of speech that kept returning because it kept being true. The flame passed hand to hand for 36 years, and if the Museum of the Order has a final room, it is empty except for that, the light itself, still burning in the only place such things are kept, which is the next pair of hands. 2 more quiet chapters belong in this history, before the map and the good night, and the first is a flight. Among all the Order's operations across both wars, one deserves telling at full length, precisely because nothing went wrong, because it is the rare mission preserved for us whole, minute by minute, and because it shows the organization at its particular best, competence wearing the disguise of an ordinary evening. It is the summer of 1995, weeks after the graveyard, and Harry Potter has spent a month marooned with the Dursleys, starved of news, patrolling suburban flower beds for scraps of Muggle headlines, and the Order's problem is simple and thorny. The boy has to be moved from the blood protection of Privet Drive to the Fidelius protection of Grimmauld Place, across a country in which the enemy is secretly rebuilding, and the Ministry would love a pretext, and it has to be done without the flu, without a portkey, without apparition, every civilized channel being either watched or traceable. So the Order does it the old way, and it sends what its members half-jokingly call the advance guard, and the roster of that guard is a small politics lesson in itself. Moody commands, because Moody always commands transport. It is his obsession and his art. Lupin seconds him, the friendly face, the one Harry knows, chosen deliberately to step forward first in a dark kitchen, so that the boy's wand, already drawn, has a reason to lower. Tonks comes, young enough to make it feel like an adventure, rather than an extraction. Kingsley comes, unhurried as furniture, and around them, Emmeline Vance, Sturgis Podmore, Daedalus Diggle, Elpheus Doge, Hestia Jones, names from the old photograph, and names soon to join the new one. 9 guards for 1 boy, which tells you what the Order, unlike the Ministry, believed about the boy. The tradecraft is worth savouring at this hour. A letter is arranged to draw the Dursleys out of the house, promising them, of all things, a suburban lawn competition, vanity exploited as cleanly as any curse. The guard comes by broom under the summer dark, and the first thing Moody does in the kitchen is complain about the security of the operation he designed, and the second is demand proof of identity from the boy they have come to collect. What form does your Patronus take? Because verification is not paranoia when you have buried friends over its absence. It is manners. Tonks packs Harry's trunk by magic, badly, cheerfully, turning her nose into a beak in the mirror while she talks, and the ordinariness of it is doing quiet work, unwinding a month of the boy's loneliness before the dangerous part starts. Then the signal, red sparks over the rooftops, and the strangest commute in suburban history rises off a lawn in Little Whinging, a formation of brooms climbing through cloud, Moody barking course corrections nobody follows, proposing doubling back over the channel for security until he is overruled by consensus and cold. Tonks whooping, Hedwig's cage rattling, London finally unrolling beneath them in ropes of orange light, the Thames a black ribbon stitched with bridges, and 9 witches and wizards, and one famous boy, descending through the night air, over a square in Islington that officially contains no number 12. Moody taps the pavement with his staff, no, with his wand, and the houses shrug apart, and the boy is inside, and the operation is over, and no curse was cast, no blood spilled, no headline written, and that, the order would tell you, is what victory usually looked like. Not the atrium duel, a teenager delivered to a kitchen smelling of dinner, grumbling adults hanging cloaks in a hall, somebody knocking over the umbrella stand, and the portrait screaming, and Molly saying supper first, questions after. Hold that flight in your mind's eye as you drift, the city sliding below, the cold clean air, the guard arrayed around you in the dark, because of all the images this history offers for the edge of sleep, being flown home under escort, by people who will not let anything happen to you, is perhaps the kindest. The second chapter, Ode Before the End, belongs to the creatures, because the Order of the Phoenix was never only human, and its animals were not mascots. They were members, by every measure that matters, service, risk, and loss, and the role of them deserves the same walking pace as the role of the people. Fawkes first, the founder's founder, the bird the whole enterprise was named for. He was ancient before the story starts, and unaged when it ends, crimson and gold, the size of a swan, given to bursting into flame on bad days, and hatching out of his own ashes, looking like a rumpled grey turkey, which Dumbledore found endlessly funny, and visitors found alarming. His service record embarrasses most wizards. He answered loyalty itself, appearing in a chamber deep under the school, because a 12-year-old spoke up for his master, blinding a basilisk, carrying 4 people to safety, on a tale that bears any weight, so long as the hands holding it are faithful. His tears heal mortal wounds, and used them, twice on record, on the same boy. He took a killing curse, meant for Dumbledore, in the ministry atrium, swallowed it whole, and died in a puff of flame, and was reborn on the floor, before the jewel missed a beat. And on the night the old man fell from the tower, Fawkes sang, one long lament over the grounds that everyone at the school heard in their chests as much as their ears, and when the song ended he flew, and no one ever saw him again. He did not die. Phoenixes decline the concept. He simply concluded, the way music does, and the order he was named for did the same in its time, which one likes to think he knew. Hedwig was an owl, and the temptation is to say only an owl, and the temptation should be resisted. She was purchased as a birthday gift by a half-giant for a boy who had never received one, and for 6 years she was the boy's single continuous companion, his post office, his link to every friend he had, and, in the Dursley summers, his only proof that the other world existed. Her opinions were administered by nipping, her grudges held with dignity. She died in the first minute of the Battle of the 7 Potters, in her cage, by a curse aimed at her boy, and the accounts note that Harry's war, in some interior sense, started at that instant, grief arriving before the battle was even properly joined. Buckbeak the Hippogriff, proud, grey, unjustly condemned to death by a bribed committee for the crime of being insulted, was rescued from execution by 2 children and a time-turner in the Order's finest piece of unofficial business, carried a fugitive across the country, shared that fugitive's exile in a cave above Hogsmeade eating rats, and years later, at the last battle, led the Thestrals against the giants. The Thestrals themselves, the black-winged horses, visible only to those who have watched death, patient, wise smelling of the dark, carried 6 children to London on the war's worst night without being asked twice. Crookshanks, half Kneazle, squashed of face and magnificent of judgment, identified the traitor Pettigrew, in his rat disguise, a full year before any human managed it, and conducted, with the fugitive Sirius, the only interspecies counterintelligence partnership in the Order's records. Pigwidgeon delivered letters with more enthusiasm than aerodynamics. Arnold the Pygmy Puff kept a girl company through an occupied year. Even the goats of the Hogshead served, in their way, as cover, atmosphere, and the running joke that kept a bitter man approachable. Wars are usually accounted in human loyalty, and the Order's books do not balance without the other kind, given freely, paid in full, by creatures who understood, in whatever way creatures understand, that the people they attach themselves to were worth the attachment. On the grounds of Hogwarts there is a spot where an owl's cage was buried, and another where a magical eye rests under a tree, and no plaque marks either, and both are visited. One further set of night thoughts has earned its place before the map, and it concerns the people this history could so easily leave as scenery, the ones who were never members and carried the order anyway, because no secret society survives 36 years on its membership alone. It survives on its perimeter, the wide, soft ring of people who suspected, or half knew, or knew and said nothing, and the order's perimeter was a country. Think of Madame Rosmerta, of the Three Broomsticks, pouring drinks for order members and ministry officials at adjacent tables for 2 decades, keeping every confidence the job brought her, and think of what it cost her to learn, after the tower, that the enemy had spent a year using her too, her body under the imperious curse, her cellar, her trust, and that she had been made an unknowing instrument in a murder she would have died to prevent. She reopened the pub. She kept pouring. The perimeter's courage was mostly of that kind, unphotogenic, expressed as continuing. Think of Andromeda Tonks, born black, sister to Bellatrix and Narcissa, the middle daughter who married a muggle born for love and was burned off the family tree a generation before Sirius, who gave the war her husband and her daughter and her son-in-law inside a single year, and was left at its end holding a month-old grandson and a house full of silence, and raised the boy so well that every account of Teddy Lupin's happiness is, properly read, a citation of hers. She never joined anything. She simply absorbed what the war did to joiners, which may be the harder assignment. Think of Xenophilius Lovegood, printing support for Harry Potter in his mad, brave little magazine when the Daily Prophet had gone over, until they took his daughter, and then printing what they told him to, and trying, half out of his mind, to trade the boy for her, and the order's verdict on him, delivered by the boy himself, was not condemnation but recognition. He had done what desperate love does, and Luna, freed, went home to her father, and the paper resumed, and history has been gentle with them, as it should be. The perimeter broke sometimes. It bent far more often than it broke, and every bend that did not break bought the centre another week. And think, last of all along that ring, of the Muggles, the millions who spent both wars inside them, without ever learning the wars existed. The bridge that fell was a girder failure. The murdered families were gas leaks. The fog of breeding dementors was a run of bad weather, discussed at bus stops, and the despair it pressed into Muggle towns was diagnosed 1,000 ways by people who could not know they were living downwind of a prison break. The Order fought, in the strictest sense, for strangers who would never be permitted to know they had been fought for, and there is a purity in that arrangement worth turning over as sleep comes, protection with the credit permanently removed, the good deed sealed at both ends. Kingsley put it simplest, on the radio, in the occupied year, when a co-host suggested wizards should look after their own first. Every human life is worth the same, he said, and worth saving. It was treason to the regime, doctrine to the order, and, the record quietly notes, the future minister's entire platform, delivered in one sentence from a shack. There is a version of this story, told often, in which its hinge is power, the prophecy, the wand, the scar, the great jewel at sunrise. Tonight's telling has tried to keep faith with a different hinge, the one the members themselves kept pointing to whenever anyone asked, usually while deflecting the question with tea. The hinge was smallness, a watch, a wrapper, a shard of mirror, a barman's nod, a house elf thanked, one password remembered, one shift covered, a name read on the radio into the dark. The enemy built at the scale of monuments, and monuments, the Order learned twice, photograph well and fall in a night. The Order built at the scale of kitchens, and kitchens are rebuilt by breakfast. If you take one thing from these 3 hours into your sleep, past the battles and the secrets and the ledger of the dead, let it be the sound of that kitchen at Grimmauld Place, or the Burrow on an ordinary war evening. Cutlery, argument, somebody's wet cloak steaming by the fire, the clock's hands all pointing at mortal peril, and the potatoes needing doing anyway, because that sound, more than any incantation in the record, is what the Order of the Phoenix actually was, and the dark could not get in while it was being made. Before those places, a brief accounting of the Order's numbers across time, told slowly, because the arithmetic of the organization is its own lullaby of a kind, small figures repeating against large ones. The First Order, at its fullest, likely never exceeded 30 or so active members, and by the night of Godric's Hollow it had been cut, by Moody's own grim census, to a fraction of that, the photographs' faces going dark one by one, until the survivors could hold their reunions around a single table. The Second Order began as perhaps a dozen at that first summons in the hospital wing, and grew toward its own 30 or 40, counting the perimeter's firmest members, and it too was pruned, year on year, until the veterans at the Battle of Hogwarts could be counted on 2 hands. Against them, across both wars, stood an enemy whose inner circle alone matched the Order's full strength, whose marked followers ran to the hundreds, and whose coerced, cursed, and frightened auxiliaries ran to numbers no one ever fixed. The ministry the Order twice declined to become employed thousands. The school it twice defended slept hundreds. And the pattern that emerges from the figures, turned over gently enough, is the one every member eventually noticed for themselves, that the Order was always the smallest thing on any battlefield it stood on, smaller than its enemies, smaller than its allies, smaller than the institutions it saved, and that its size was never once the variable that decided anything. What decided things, every time, was position. The Order was simply where it needed to be, a barman at a door, a spy at a shoulder, a cat lady at a window, 9 brooms over Surrey, 1 round face in a crowd refusing, and being where you are needed is a property that does not scale and does not have to. Armies are counted, watchmen are placed. The Order understood the difference earlier than anyone, and the understanding is the whole of its strategy, and it fits, you will notice, inside a single sleeping breath. And a last small chapter, since the night still has room for one, on the Order's humour, because no honest history of these people closes without it, and because laughter, in the record, appears with the regularity of a supply line, which is what it was. Fred and George conducting their entire war as comedy, fireworks against tyranny, a swamp installed in a 5th-floor corridor, and left there by the staff as a monument, a resignation joke delivered mid-duel that became, unbearably, a last gift. Tonks at the dinner table turning her nose into a pig's snout for an audience of one traumatized teenager, on purpose, until he laughed, Sirius bowing to his own mother's shrieking portrait, Dumbledore, at the height of his powers, telling a stunned Great Hall that he had a few words, and that they were nitwit, blubber, oddment, and tweak. Moody, of all people, deadpan under the paranoia, growling that he would drink from his own flask at a wedding, thank you, and toasting with it. McGonagall offering a Death Eater's colleague a biscuit. The pattern is too consistent to be accident. These were people who had learned, in the oldest school there is, that fear kills before the curse arrives, and that a joke at the right moment is a shield charm cast on everyone in earshot. The enemy, it is worth noticing at the very end, never laughed, not once in 36 years of records, except at other people's pain. It may be the cleanest dividing line the whole war offers, cleaner than blood, cleaner than houses, and you can carry it into sleep as a compass no bigger than a smile. Find the people who can still be funny in a kitchen at the end of the world. That is where the Order is. It always was. And as the very last movement of this long night, walk the places. Every organization has a geography, and the Order's map is drawn in kitchens and back rooms rather than fortresses, and visiting them one final time, slowly, in the mind's low light, is the right way to let the story settle into sleep. Godric's Hollow first, the village in the West Country where it began, and, in a sense, where it kept beginning. A church, a square, a war memorial, that shivers as you pass it into a statue of a family of 3, that Muggle eyes never see. A cottage on the edge of the village, kept ruined on purpose. The top floor still torn open to the weather after all these years, because the wizarding community chose to preserve the damage as its own monument, and the garden gate that creaks, and the sign that rises out of the ground for magical visitors. Its official inscription about the family, long since crowded round with decades of graffiti, names and initials, and long life to Harry Potter, scratched in by travellers, vandalism by every regulation, and the signs keepers never clean it, because some vandalism is testimony. Snow suits the village, the accounts agree. It was snowing, carols drifting from the church, on the night in the last winter of the war, when Harry finally stood at his parents' grave for the first time in his remembered life, Hermione beside him, conjuring a wreath, and the church bells counting Christmas Eve, and of all the scenes this history holds, that one asks most gently to be the one you carry towards sleep. The burrow next, crooked against the Devon sky, 4 or 5 stories deciding among themselves which way to lean, held up, all parties admit, by magic and by nothing else. Chickens in the yard, gnomes in the hedges, Wellington boots by a door that was never once, in the entire history of 2 wars, locked to a friend. Strategy was argued at that kitchen table, and denoming rosters posted beside battle plans, and the order's soldiers were fed at it so relentlessly that feeding became indistinguishable from doctrine. It was watched, raided, abandoned for a season, and reoccupied with the stubbornness of bindweed, and it hosted the wedding where the world ended and, years later, the Sunday lunches where it is confirmed the world went on. If the ministry was the war's head, and Hogwarts its heart, the burrow was its stomach, and armies, the muggles are correct, march on that. The Hog's Head, third, smelling faintly and permanently of goats, sawdust on the floor, glasses cleaned to a standard best described as negotiable, the barman's blue eyes missing nothing over the tops of them. Everything important happened in that building at least once. The order was seeded there, the prophecy spoken and half stolen there, Dumbledore's army founded in its back room, under the barman's studied indifference, the student underground fed through its cellar, the last battle mustered down its secret passage behind a painted girl. History kept choosing the shabby pub over every marble hall in Britain, and the choice was not accidental. Institutions were watched, the Hog's Head was beneath watching, and its whole strategic value flowed from its refusal to be respectable, which made it, among other things, the perfect monument to its owner. Grimmauld Place, fourth, and even now, even settled and softened, the mind lowers its voice at that address. The gas lamps, the troll's leg umbrella stand, the shrieking portrait finally silenced, one hopes, by some charm or simple mercy of time, the old family tree on the wall, with its scorch marks, the drawing room where a locket sat in a glass case unrecognized, the kitchen underneath where the order argued across a scrubbed table, under strings of drying herbs, Sirius at the head of it, too loud on purpose, a man filling with noise a house that had spent decades teaching him silence. The house was the order's whole predicament rendered in architecture, a hostile inheritance made useful, an enemy structure occupied but never quite converted, and the work of living in it anyway, meeting in it, feeding people in it, is as good a miniature of the entire war as exists. Shell Cottage, fifth, whitewashed on its cliff, the sound present in every account of it, waves below, wind in the marram grass, the smell of salt in the bandages. It was the war's hospital and its confessional, the place broken people were carried to, a tortured girl, a dying elf, a wandmaker aged past his years, a goblin weighing a debt, and the place they either mended or were buried, and its garden holds the grave, and its kitchen held the councils where the hunt's last and maddest chapter was planned, and through all of it, a young married couple simply kept house, changed dressings, cooked, and asked no questions they were not owed. And hospitality under those conditions is a form of war fighting the textbooks have never properly credited. And Hogwarts last, always last, the castle at night, which is where this channel lives, and where every one of these long histories eventually comes home. The corridors the Order's members walked as children and defended as adults, the marble staircase they were carried up as first years, and carried down, some of them, at the end. The room of requirement dreaming behind its blank wall, the kitchens where a locket bounced on an old elf's chest, the tower where an old man fell on his own terms, the boathouse below it, the hall where the tables were pushed aside twice in one night, once for the wounded and once for the breakfast, the point on the grounds where a white tomb catches the light off the lake, and the gates where a monument names the 50. The castle absorbed the whole story, and did what castles do, went on holding children, and the children go on sleeping in its towers tonight, this very night, in the world where you are falling asleep, safe in precisely the way several dozen quiet people across 36 years arranged for them to be, and never told. If you are still with me, here at the very end of the watch, thank you for spending the night with this story. If these long histories help you rest, subscribing is the best way to support the channel, and it means more nights like this one. Tell me in the comments how far you made it before sleep took you, whether you lasted past the tower, past the forest, past the ledger of names, and if someone you know has trouble sleeping, or simply loves this world the way we do, share this video with them. It helps more than you know. And if you have your own thoughts about the Order, who you would have trusted, who you would have been, I read the comments, and I would genuinely love to know. Now let the story go. The photograph is back in its drawer. The clock's 8 hands point home. The castle is dark except for the lamps that are always lit. And somewhere in the version of the world where all of this is true, the watch has changed hands again without a sound, the way it always does, and the night shift is walking its quiet rounds so that everyone else can do exactly what you are doing now. You are safe. The work is someone else's until morning. Let your breathing slow to a walking pace, the pace the names were read at, and let the images go by one last time, without holding any of them. Snow on a church square, a crooked house against the stars, a silver doe between dark trees, moving away now, glowing softer, further, a light passing out of sight among the trunks, and the forest quiet behind it, and the snow still falling, unhurried, filling in the tracks. Sleep well. The Order has the watch.